It is a cold grey afternoon in the deep of a steppe winter, in a year so far back that we can no longer be quite sure of its number, out on the vast frozen grass of high inner Asia, and a boy is running for his life across the ice. He is thin, this boy, thin in the way that only long hunger makes a body thin, dressed in rags and the worn skins of small animals. His face chapped raw by a wind that comes down off 1,000 miles of open country, with nothing in all that distance to break it, or to slow it, or to soften it, and he is running, stumbling, half falling and catching himself again, along the frozen edge of a river, and he cannot use his arms. He cannot use his arms, because around his neck and pinning both his wrists there is locked a great heavy yoke of wood, 2 rough-hewn planks bound together with a single hole cut through for his throat, a thing the people of that country called a kang, the wooden collar that men out there fastened onto their slaves and their captives and the most dangerous of their prisoners, so that whoever wears it cannot feed himself, and cannot lie down to sleep in any comfort, and cannot lift a hand to his own face, and cannot fight, and cannot above all else easily run. And this boy is running anyway. Somewhere behind him in the failing light are the men who own him, the family that keeps him as a slave, and there has been a feast this evening, and a great deal of fermented mare's milk drunk around the fires, and in one unguarded moment the boy has swung that very collar like a club, and knocked down the single careless young man left to watch him, and bolted away into the dusk. And now here he is, out on the open ice under an enormous darkening sky, a starved and beaten and collared boy of perhaps 14 years, with no horse and no weapon and no friend within 100 miles, running from the only life he has, out into a wilderness that has already killed almost everyone he ever loved, with nothing to his name in all the wide cold world but the wooden yoke locked around his neck, and something behind his eyes that simply will not, lie down and die. Hold him there for a moment. Let him stay exactly where he is, that ragged running boy in the wooden collar, out on the freezing river with the dark coming down and the wind at his back, and we will leave him suspended right there, gentle and unhurried, and we will look away from him, up and back, the way you might lift your eyes from a single glowing page to the whole quiet warm room around you, because we are not ready yet to understand how this one hunted child came to be running across that ice, and there is no hurry at all, none whatsoever to find out. We have the whole night, and he will keep. So let the lamp burn low, and let the room be warm, and let your shoulders come down away from your ears, because there is nowhere you need to be for the next long while, and nothing you need to do, and no part of this you have to keep hold of. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever town or country, whatever kind of day is lying finished behind you, whether you are already stretched out in the dark with your eyes half closed, or sitting up somewhere with a cup going slowly cold beside you, you are welcome here. And you are exactly where you are meant to be, and you may drift off whenever you like, because the story will go on without you, patient and steady as the grass, and the boy on the ice will still be here, moving through his long and astonishing life, whether you follow every word or let it all blur soft and warm into sleep. For tonight we are going to walk, very slowly and very gently, from the very beginning to the very end, through one of the largest and strangest and most world-changing lives that any human being has ever lived. The whole long life of the boy in the wooden collar, from his first breath in a felt tent on the empty grass to his last breath, as the master of the greatest empire the earth had ever seen, and you do not have to stay awake for any of it. His name, in the beginning, was Temujin. That is the name he was born with, out there on the steppe, a plain hard name from a plain hard world, and almost no one who first knew him would have wagered a single sheep that it would ever be remembered past his own short lifetime, if he even had a long one, which seemed, for year after year, extremely unlikely. But you know his other name. Almost everyone who has ever lived since has known his other name, the name he took when he was a grown man and the lord of all the tribes, the title that the whole frightened world would come to speak in a hush, They called him Genghis Khan. And that ragged boy running across the ice in a slave's wooden collar, that starving hunted outcast with nothing at all, would live to command more of the earth than any single man before him, would rule from the shores of the Pacific to the gates of Europe, would break the proudest empires of his age like dry sticks across his knee, and would father a line of conquerors who carried his blood and his banners even farther, until a fair portion of all the people alive in the world could trace themselves back to him. That is the shape of the whole thing. That is where the road runs, all the way from the ice. Let me tell you the shape of the puzzle we are going to carry, gently, the whole way, and then we will set it down and let it answer itself in its own good time. The man is remembered, by a great part of the world, for one thing above all others, and that is destruction. For the burned cities and the emptied plains and the mountains of the slain, for being the great scourge, the storm out of the east, the most terrible conqueror in all of history. And that picture is not exactly false, and we will not pretend to you before this is over that it is false. For terrible things were truly done. But it is also only the outer wall of him, the part his enemies wrote down, and underneath it and behind it there is another Temujin entirely, harder to see and far more interesting. A man who began not as a prince or a warlord's heir with armies at his back, but as the very lowest thing his world contained. An abandoned child, a hunted orphan, a slave in a collar, a boy left out on the grass to starve. And the true puzzle, the coal we will keep warm in the ashes all the way from here to the end, is not really how a great king conquered the world. Kings conquer. It is how this one, this nothing, this outcast with no cattle and no clan and no name worth the breath to say it, clawed his way up out of the frozen mud of the very bottom of the world and made himself its master. How does the boy on the ice become the lord of the earth? Set that down now. Let it rest. We do not need it yet. Instead, let us leave him running there, safe in the amber of that one bitter evening, and let us go back, all the way back, past the collar and past the running boy, back to before he was ever born, to understand the strange and empty and beautiful and pitiless world he was born into. Because you cannot understand the man until you understand the grass that made him. So picture it, softly, the way you would settle into a wide view from a high and peaceful place. Picture the steppe. Far up in the middle of the great landmass of Asia, higher and colder and emptier than almost anywhere people have ever tried to live, there lies an ocean of grass. It rolls on, mile after mile after mile, unfenced and almost treeless, a vast rippling sea of green in the short warm summers, and of frozen brown and white in the long murderous winters, under a sky so huge and so close and so full of weather that a person standing beneath it can feel like the last soul left alive in all creation. There are no cities out here, in the time we are speaking of, some 8.5 centuries ago, in the middle of what the far-off Christian world was calling the 12th century. There are no roads, no walls, no farms, no fields of grain. There is only the grass, and the enormous herds of horses and sheep and goats and cattle that feed upon it, and the scattered wandering peoples who follow those herds across the seasons, folding up their round felt tents and loading them onto carts and moving on whenever the grazing runs thin. A whole world of families on the move beneath the wheeling sky. And it is a hard world, and a poor one, and a violent one. For the grass is wide, but the good grass is not endless, and the herds are wealth, and the herds are life. And so the tribes and the clans that share this ocean of grass are forever raiding one another, forever driving off one another's animals, and carrying off one another's women and settling one another's blood debts. Feud stacked upon feud stacked upon feud, going back so far that no one quite remembers how they began, only that they must be paid. There are many peoples out on that grass in those days, and they have names that will come to matter to us before the night is through. The Tatars away to the east, the Keret in the centre, the Naiman to the west, the Merkit to the north by the cold forests, and scattered among them all the loose and quarrelling clans of the people who called themselves, simply, the Mongols, who were in those days no great nation at all, but only one more set of feuding herdsmen, poor and divided and beaten and of no importance whatever to the wider world, which had scarcely heard of them and did not care. And into that world, into one of those poor and quarrelling Mongol clans, in a year that the old accounts leave soft, but which we usually settle at about 1162 of the Common Era, a child was born, in a felt tent on the banks of a river called the Onon, up near the northern edge of the grass, where it begins to give way to the cold forests. His father was a man named Yasuge, a chief of sorts, a hardened and respected warrior of the Borjigin, a leading line among the Mongols, a man with a following and a name, but not with anything you could truly call a kingdom, for there were no kingdoms out there to have. And there is a story told about the very moment of this child's birth, and I will tell it to you gently, because it is the first of the many legends that gathered around him, and whether it happened or not scarcely matters, for what matters is that his own people believed it and told it, and felt that it meant something. They said that when the baby came into the world, he came clutching his right hand tight shut, and when they opened the small fist to see, there was found inside it, pressed into his palm, a hard black clot of blood, dark and gleaming, about the size of a knuckle bone. And to the people of the grass, who read signs in everything, and who knew exactly what blood meant in a world built on feud and raid, this was a sign that could not be mistaken. This child had been born already gripping blood in his hand. He was marked. He would be a man of destiny, a shedder of blood, a taker of things, a lord. So they said, afterward, whether his mother, exhausted on the veldt in the cold, thought anything at all so grand in that first hour, we cannot know, and I rather doubt it. She had a baby to keep alive through a steppe winter, and that was task enough. They named him Temujin, and there is a small grim reason for the name that tells you, better than anything, what kind of world he was born into. Not long before the child came, his father Yasuge had ridden out to war against the Tatars, the old and hated enemies of the Mongols away to the east, and had won, and had brought home a captured Tatar chieftain, a man whose name was Temujin Uge, and by the custom of that country, to mark a victory and perhaps to claim a little of a strong enemy's strength, Yasuge gave his newborn son the beaten foe's name. So the boy was called Temujin after a captured enemy, named out of a raid and a killing, his whole life stamped from the first day with the endless back and forth of steppe vengeance, and it is worth holding, softly, that the very Tatars whose defeat gave him his name would, before very many years had passed, murder his father and set the whole terrible engine of his life in motion. His mother was a woman named Holan, and she was a strong one, strong in body and strong in will, and she would need every scrap of that strength before her life was done. And around little Temujin, as the years went by, there grew up the ordinary crowded family of a steppe chief, brothers and half-brothers and a sister, the whole loud tangle of a herding household. And for a while, for a few short years, the boy's childhood ran on much as any child's did out there on the grass. He learned to ride almost before he could properly walk, as all the children of that world did, strapped onto a horse's back as a toddler, and half wild in the saddle by the time he was 5 or 6. He learned to draw a small bow, and to loose an arrow at marmots and birds, to endure the cold, to help drive the herds, to know the smell of coming weather, and the shape of the land, and the ways of the animals that were his family's whole wealth. It was a hard childhood, but not yet an unlucky one. He was the son of a chief. He had a place. And then, when he was 9 years old, the ground opened under all of it, and everything changed at once. For when Temujin turned 9, his father Yasuge took him on a journey, in the old custom of the grass, to leave the boy for a while among another clan, so that he might grow up in the keeping of the family into which he would one day marry, a way of binding 2 households together, and making a boy into a man among near strangers. And having settled his son among these people, Yasuge turned his horse for home, and rode back alone across the long empty miles toward his own camp, and on the way, out on the open grass, he came upon a band of Tatars, those same old enemies, gathered at a feast. Now the custom of the steppe, harsh as that world was, held that a traveller might stop at any camp and be given food and drink, even at the camp of an enemy. For out in that vast emptiness to refuse a man hospitality could be to condemn him to death. And so Yasuge stopped, and sat down among the Tatars, and ate and drank with them as the custom allowed. But the Tatars, looking at this lone Mongol chief who had sat down at their fire, knew him. They knew his face. They remembered Yasuge, remembered his raids, remembered their own dead, and they said nothing, and they smiled, and into his food or his drink, quietly, they worked a slow poison, and Yasuge, suspecting nothing, thanked them and rode on. But before he had gone very far he began to feel it, a sickness spreading and deepening in him with every mile, and by the time he reached his own tents at last he was a dying man. He lingered a few days, knowing what had been done to him, and in that time he sent a rider galloping to fetch his boy Temujin home, but the grass is wide and the miles are long, and Yasuge died before his son could reach him. The 9-year-old boy came home to a father already dead, poisoned by the enemies whose name he bore, and to a family whose whole shelter and standing in the world had just been ripped away in a single stroke. And here, softly, is where the true story of Temujin begins, not with the blood in the fist, but with the loss of the father, because in the world of the steppe a household without a strong man at its head was a household without protection, and protection was the only thing that stood between a family and death. Yasuge had been a chief, a leader of his clan, and his followers had obeyed him because he was strong, and because he could reward them and defend them. But a dead man can do neither, and his heir was a boy of 9. And so the thing happened that Holen must have dreaded from the moment her husband breathed his last. The clan turned its back on them. When the tribe next broke camp to follow the grazing, in the spring, the leading families of the Tayakyud, the proud kinsmen who had followed Yasuge, simply packed up their tents and their carts and their herds and moved off across the grass and left the widow and her little children behind. They took the animals, they took the followers, they took everything that had made the family a family of consequence, and they abandoned Holen and her 7 small children out on the open steppe with almost nothing, to live or to die as the grass decided. And the grass, as a rule, decided death. There is a story told of that moment too, and it is a fierce one. They say that as the clan was riding away, Holen, that strong-willed woman, seized up her dead husband's standard, the horse-tail banner that was the sign of his authority, and mounted a horse and galloped after the departing families, and rode among them holding the banner high and shaming them, crying out against them for deserting the children of their own chief, and that for very shame a handful of them turned back and stayed with her, for a little while. But only for a little while. Shame is thin food, and the pull of the strong toward the strong was stronger, and one by one they drifted away again after the powerful, and left the widow to it. And so there they were, Holen and her children, alone on the enormous grass. There was Temujin, the eldest of her own sons, and his younger brothers Kasar and Kakyun, and little Temuj, and a baby daughter. And there were 2 older half-brothers as well, Bekta and Belgutai, the sons of Yasuge by another wife, and 1 grown woman to keep the whole starving brood alive. They had no herd worth the name, they had no clan, they had no place in the world at all. They had fallen, in a single season, from the family of a chief to the very lowest thing the steppe knew, an outcast household with no one to protect it, and the years that followed were years of a hunger and a hardness that it is difficult, in a warm room, even to imagine. For this is how they lived, in those years after the abandonment, and I will lay it out gently, because it is the ground the whole rest of the story grew from. They lived off the wild land directly, the way the poorest of the poor did, scratching a bare survival from a country that gave up nothing easily. Holen, who had been the wife of a chief, went out with a digging stick and grubbed for wild roots and onions and the little bitter bulbs that grew among the grass. The boys hunted whatever small thing they could kill, marmots and ground squirrels and the burrowing rats of the steppe, and they set snares for birds. And when the ice came, they fished through it in the frozen rivers, and they gathered wild fruit in its short season and dried it against the winter. There were days, surely many days, when there was very nearly nothing, when the cold came down and the snow lay deep, and a family with no herd and no stores had only what the boys could catch that morning between it and starving. This is a childhood almost without a flaw beneath it, a childhood of ceaseless cold and ceaseless hunger and ceaseless labour merely to stay alive one more day. And it went on not for a season, but for years, and it forged the boy Temujin the way a hammer forges iron, blow after blow after blow, hard and then harder. He learned in those years, down at the very bottom, lessons that the sheltered sons of the great never learned at all. He learned exactly how little there was between any person and death. He learned the absolute, unbending value of loyalty, because he had watched loyalty fail, had watched his father's own followers ride away and leave his mother to starve, and he would remember that betrayal and prize the opposite of it for the whole of his life. And he learned in his own bones that blood kinship counted for nothing if the blood was weak, and that a person survives not by the family he is born to, but by the strength and the will and the bonds he can forge for himself. Hold that. It is one of the great keys to the whole man. And it was in these starving years, when Temujin was still only a boy of perhaps 13, that the family's hardness turned inward, and something dark and irreversible happened. And I will tell it to you softly and plainly, the way such hard things are best told, and then we will move gently on. Among the children there was friction, as there is in any crowded, desperate house, and the sharpest of it ran between Temujin and his older half-brother, Bekta, the son of the other wife. Bekta was a little older and a little bigger, and in a house with almost nothing to go around he had begun to take things, to use his size to seize the small catches of the hunt for himself. And one day, so the old account tells us, it came to a head over the smallest of things, over a fish that Temujin and his brother Kasar had caught, a bright little fish pulled from the river, and over a lark, a bird, that Bekta took from them, snatched away from the younger boys who had caught them, in a household where a single fish and a single bird could be the difference between a hungry night and an empty one. And Temujin, something in him having reached its limit, went to his mother, furious, and Holan tried to calm him and to shame him back into peace, telling the quarrelling children that they had no one in all the world but one another, and must not turn on their own. But the thing had gone too deep, and so Temujin and Kasar, the two of them together, took up their small bows and crept up on Bekta where he sat alone out on a little rise, watching the family's few horses, and they came at him from the front and from the back, and they shot him, their own half-brother, and they killed him, there on the grass, over a fish and a bird. And it is said that Bekta, seeing what was coming and knowing he could not stop it, did not fight or flee, but only asked them, at the last, not to harm his young full brother Belgatai, and then sat still and let them do it. And when they came home, their mother knew at once what they had done, and she turned on them a rage so terrible that the old account remembers her very words across 800 years, calling them killers, comparing them to wild beasts that savage their own, to wolves and hawks and mad dogs that turn upon their own kind, crying out that they had destroyed one of the family's own precious few when the whole world was already against them. It is a dark, dark hinge in the story, and I will not dress it up for you, only set it down and let it be what it was, the act of a starving and desperate child in a starving and desperate place, but hold it gently for what it also shows, under the horror of it, of the boy Temujin, even at 13. It shows a will that would not be ruled, not even by an older brother, not even by his own mother's fury, a boy who, when he decided a thing had to be, saw it done to the end and did not flinch from it. That iron was in him already. It would carry him to the top of the world, and it would cost along the way a very great deal. And it was not long after this, with the family still clinging to the edge of survival, that the last and the hardest of the childhood blows fell, the one that brings us all the way back around to where we began tonight, to the boy on the ice. The word of Temujin was beginning to travel, quietly, out on the grass. He was growing now, growing into a strong and capable and dangerous young man, and the very clan that had abandoned his family, the Taikiud, the proud kinsman who had ridden away and left the children to starve, began to hear of it and to worry. A dead chief's son who lived and grew strong was a danger to the men who had stepped into his father's place, for such a boy might one day come back to claim what had been his, and to settle the score for the abandonment. And so the Taichiud decided to snuff the danger out while it was still young. Their leader gathered a band of riders and came down upon Holern's little camp, and the family scattered and fled into the woods and the broken country, but it was Temujin they wanted, and it was Temujin they ran down and caught. And they did not kill him, which was perhaps their great mistake, but chose instead to break him and shame him and keep him low. They locked around his neck and his wrists that heavy wooden collar, the kang, the yoke of a slave and a prisoner, and they carried him back to their camps, and they kept him there as a captive, passed from tent to tent, from family to family, each household guarding the collared boy for a time, and then handing him on. A living warning to anyone who might have thought the son of Yasuge still amounted to anything at all. And so we come round again, gently, all the way back to the ice and the running boy. And now you know who he is, and how he came to be there, and what is locked around his neck, and why. But Temujin did not mean to spend his life as a slave in a wooden collar, passed from hand to hand among the very people who had betrayed his father. He watched, and he waited, and he learned the ways of the camp that held him, and he chose his moment with a patience remarkable in a boy of his age. There came a night of feasting, a great gathering by the river with much drinking, and by evening the crowd had thinned and wandered, and the guarding of the collared captive had been left to a single young man, careless with drink and thinking the beaten boy no threat at all. And in that moment Temujin moved. He swung the heavy kang itself, the very instrument of his bondage, and struck the young guard down with it, and then he ran, out into the dusk, along the frozen river, that same starved and hunted figure in the wooden collar that we opened upon tonight, running for his life across the ice, with the alarm going up behind him, and the whole camp soon to be hunting him through the dark. And he could not have gone far, and he could not have gotten the collar off alone, and he should, by every reasonable reckoning, have been caught and killed before morning. But here the story turns on one of those small, quiet acts of mercy that decide everything. For as the pursuit spread out through the night, Temujin slipped into the river itself and lay back in the freezing shallows, with only his face above the water and the wooden collar floating around his neck, hidden there in the cold and the reeds while the searchers passed. And a man of another clan camped nearby, a man named Sorkin Shira, chanced to see him lying there in the water, and knew him, and understood in an instant what he was seeing, an escaped captive hiding for his life. And this man, who owed Temujin nothing, looked down at the boy in the river, and felt something move in him, some flicker of pity or of respect for the sheer stubborn will of it, and he did not raise the alarm. He said quietly that a clever boy with fire in his eyes was no bad thing, and he let the search pass on, and later when the hunt had cooled, he took the shivering boy secretly into his own tent, and his own children, moved by the same mercy, struck the wooden collar from his neck at last and burned it, and hid him under a great heap of wool in a cart while his pursuers came searching from tent to tent. And then, when the time was right, they gave him a horse and a little food and sent him away into the night, back toward his own people. And Temujin rode home, out across the empty grass, to the little scattered camp of his mother and his brothers. Having escaped the Taikiud with his own life, and nothing else at all, no herd, no followers, no wealth, no clan, no place in the world, nothing whatever to his name but the clothes on his back, and the horse beneath him and locked away inside him where no collar could reach it. that same unbreakable iron will that had carried him through the killing cold. The will that would not lie down. The will that would, in time, remake the entire world. And there, for tonight's portion, we will let the story rest, poised and quiet, the way we like to leave things. The boy has come home through the dark. He is an outcast still, the lowest of the low, a nobody on the empty grass with everything against him and almost nothing in his hands. But he is alive, and he is free, and he has learned, in these first hard years, every single lesson he will ever need about loyalty and betrayal, about hunger and endurance, about the worth of a bond forged rather than inherited, about the cost of an iron will and the strange mercy of strangers. He does not know yet, and neither, quite do we, all the vast and terrible and dazzling road that lies before him, the friends he will make and the friends he will lose, the tribes he will gather and the empires he will break, the golden years still 40 long years off across the grass. But that is the beginning of another part of the story, and it can wait, for we have come a long way tonight already, from a boy running across the ice all the way back to the empty world that made him, and forward again to that same boy riding home with nothing but his life. So let your breath go slow, and let the boy ride home under the enormous step stars, safe for now, unhurried, his whole strange future still folded up and waiting inside him, and let yourself, wherever you are, sink a little deeper into the warmth and the dark, because the story is in no hurry, and neither are you, and it will all still be here, patient and waiting, whenever you are ready to come back to it. And so he came home to them with nothing. That is where we left him, and that is where we may begin again tonight, softly, with no need to hurry, a boy of perhaps 15 or 16 walking back across the open grass into his mother's poor little camp, having slipped his wooden collar and hidden in a cold river through a long night, and outwitted the men who meant to keep him a slave forever, and having, at the end of all that danger, precisely nothing to show for it. No cattle to speak of, no sheep worth counting, no tent full of retainers, no herd spread dark across the hillside, none of the things that made a man someone on that steppe. Just his mother Holen, still holding the little family together by will alone, and his brothers, and a few horses, and the wide indifferent grass running away in every direction to the edge of the sky. If you had ridden past that camp in those years, one poor family among the thousands scratching a living off the Mongolian plateau, you would not have looked at it twice. There was nothing there to look at. And that is the thing I want you to hold gently at the very start of this chapter, because it is the strangest thing in the whole strange story, and we are going to watch it happen so slowly that you will hardly see the moment it turns. This boy with nothing, this nobody, this orphaned son of a poisoned chief whose own clan had thrown him away to starve, was going to begin, from exactly here, from the bottom, to draw other human beings toward himself, one at a time, and then by the dozen, and then by the thousand, until the whole of that scattered warring world had gathered under his hand. And he did it, at the beginning, not with an army, for he had no army, and not with gold, for he had no gold, but with something much smaller and much harder to name, a quality people felt when they were near him, and could not quite put down, and we are going to spend tonight watching the very first of them feel it. For a man who owned nothing else owned, still, the one thing that mattered most on the steppe. And it was not horses, and it was not grass. It was loyalty. It was the bond between people, the web of who would ride for whom, and who would stand beside whom when the raiders came in the night. And out on that hard grassland this was the only true wealth there was, because a man alone, however brave, was simply a dead man who had not yet met the right enemy, and everyone knew it. The steppe ran on a great invisible net of these bonds. There was the bond of blood, of clan and kin, which had already failed Temujin once when his father's people abandoned him. There was the bond of the sworn friend, the Anda, 2 men who swore themselves brothers by choice rather than by birth, exchanging gifts and mingling, in the old way a drop of each other's blood, a bond that was held to be deeper than kinship because it was chosen. And there was the bond of the Nakor, the companion, the free man who attached himself to a leader he believed in, and served him not because he was born to, but because he wanted to. And Temujin, who had been failed by the bond of blood, was going to become, over the years we are entering now, the greatest master the world has ever seen of those other two bonds. The chosen ones. The ones a man earns. He gathered people. That was his gift before he was a soldier or a lawgiver or a conqueror of cities, and the first person he ever gathered came to him, fittingly, over a matter of stolen horses. It happened like this, and it is a small story, but I love it, so let us go slowly. One day, raiders swept down on the little camp and drove off almost all the horses they had, 8 pale silver-grey geldings, very nearly the whole of the family's moving wealth, gone in a cloud of dust before anyone could stop them. It was the kind of blow that could finish a poor family, and there was only one horse left, a plain sandy-coloured one that a younger brother had been out riding, and when he came back Temujin took it and set off alone after the thieves, a boy chasing a warband across the open country to get back the only thing his family had. He rode for days on the trail of the stolen horses, and on the way he came to a camp where a sturdy young man about his own age was milking mares in a field, and he stopped and asked, the way a traveller does, whether the fellow had seen 8 silver-grey geldings pass by. And here is the moment, and it is so quiet you could miss it. The young man, whose name was Boorchu, the only son of a fairly well-off herdsman, did not merely point down the road. He looked at this stranger, this poor boy chasing an impossible number of thieves on one tired horse, and something in him decided, on the spot, to throw in his lot with him. He said, in effect, you are in trouble, and the troubles of a man are the same for all men. I will come with you. He hid Temujin's worn-out horse and gave him a fresh one and told no one, not even his own father, and the two of them rode off together after the thieves, 2 boys against a warband, and they found the stolen horses, and in the grey of the dawn they cut them out of the raiders' herd and ran them off and rode for their lives with the angry owners galloping behind. And they got clean away, and when it was over and they had brought the whole 8 geldings safely back, Temujin did the thing that tells you, already, the whole shape of the man he would be. He tried to give Boorchu half the horses. Take half, he said. You saved them. They are as much yours as mine. For what else are they for? And Boorchu would not take a single one. I came with you, he said, because you were a good man in trouble, not to be paid. And if I took your horses for helping you, what kind of companion would that make me? And he turned and rode home to his father, who had been frightened half to death by his son's disappearance, and then, hearing the story, wept with relief and pride, and told the 2 young men to hold fast to one another, and never abandon each other as long as they lived. Hold that exchange in your mind for a moment, gently, because everything is in it. A boy with almost nothing tried to give away half of what little he had, freely to the man who helped him, and the man, moved by exactly that, refused the payment and gave instead the one thing worth more than horses, which was himself. Not long after, Boorchu left his comfortable home and his father's herds and came to Temujin for good, to be his companion, his Nokor, the first of all the great men who would gather to that name, and he stayed at Temujin's side, faithful, for the rest of his life through 40 years and half a world of war. That is how it began. One friend, won over a matter of stolen horses, by a poor boy who understood, without ever being taught, that the way to bind a free man to you forever is to be worth following and to share what you have. Now before the raiders came, back when his father was still alive, a thing had been arranged for Temujin, and the time had come at last to see it done. You may remember, or if you were already drifting you need not, that on the very journey during which his father was poisoned, the boy Temujin had been left, at the age of 9, in the camp of a man named Sechin of the Ongirat people, a folk famous for their beautiful daughters, and there he had been betrothed to Sechin's little daughter, a girl named Borte, a a year or so older than himself. The two children had been promised to each other and then torn apart by the father's death and all the long years of ruin that followed, and you might think such a promise, made between a dead man and a poor family fallen out of the world, would simply have been forgotten. But it was not. When Temujin was grown, 16 or so, with his family a little steadier on its feet, he rode back across the grass with one of his brothers to find the Ongirat camp again and to see whether the old betrothal still stood. And Day Sechin, when the ragged young man appeared at his tent after 7 years of silence, did not turn him away. He was overjoyed. He had wondered, he said, what had become of the boy. He had feared him dead. And here he was, come to claim his bride at last. And so Temujin was married to Borte, the companion of his whole long life, the woman who would stand beside him through everything that is coming, wise and steady and unafraid, the mother of the sons who would inherit the world, and the one person, in all his violent and lonely rise, whose counsel he trusted above every other. It is worth pausing on her, softly, here at her entrance, because the histories that love to shout about his battles tend to whisper about his marriage, and yet the marriage was the truer thing. He would take other wives in time, many of them, as a great Khan did. But Borte was first, and Borte was chief, and Borte was the one he came home to, and their bond, made when they were both poor and nobody, held to the end. And Borte came to her marriage with a gift, and that gift is the small hinge on which the next great turn of the story swings, so let us follow it. Her mother sent her off to her new life with a splendid thing, a coat of black sable fur, deep and glossy and enormously valuable, the sort of garment a prince might envy, the finest object, by a long way, that anyone in Temujin's poor family had ever possessed. And a lesser man, a smaller man, would have kept it, would have worn it and been warm, and felt, for once rich. Temujin did no such thing. He looked at that magnificent coat and he saw, not warmth, but a key, a thing that could be spent to buy something far larger than fur. For he had a plan, this landless young man, a plan of startling ambition for someone with 8 horses and a tent. And the plan was to find himself a protector, a lord, a great and powerful patron who could gather his scattered people back to him and set him on the first rung of the ladder up. And he knew exactly whom to go to. Far to the south, among the Keret, one of the largest and most powerful confederations on the whole steppe, there ruled a mighty Khan named Togrul, a hard, canny, much betrayed old prince who had fought his way to the top of his own people over a lifetime of feuds. And this Togrul had once, long ago, sworn the oath of the Anda, the sworn brotherhood, with Temujin's own dead father Yesugei. They had been blood brothers, the two of them in the old chief's better days. And Temujin, who forgot nothing and understood how these bonds worked better than men 3 times his age, took Borte's black sable coat, the family's one treasure, and rode to the Keret to lay it at the feet of the powerful Khan who had been his father's sworn brother, and to say, in effect, my father is dead. And you were his Anda, and the bond of the Anda passes to the son, and so you are as a father to me, and here is a gift, and I have come to be yours. It was beautifully done. Togrul was flattered and pleased, as such a man would be, to have the ragged son of his old friend appear before him with a princely gift and the graceful, correct ancient words of the bond on his lips, and he took the coat, and he took the young man under his protection, and he said the thing Temujin had crossed all that country to hear. In return for the sable coat, he said, I will bring your scattered people together again for you. I will be your father. And just like that, with a piece of fur and a few well-chosen words, the landless boy had acquired the most powerful friend on the steppe, a great Khan who now counted him a kind of son, and had taken his first real step up out of the grass. This is what I meant when I said he gathered people. He had, in a handful of years, gathered a faithful companion in Booshu, and a wise wife in Borte, and now a mighty patron in Togrul. And he had done it with nothing but character and cleverness and a single coat. And around this little core of loyalty, other free men began, slowly, to drift in and attach themselves, a few here and a few there. A young smith's son named Jelme sent by his father to serve, and others until the poor camp on the grass was not quite so poor and not quite so friendless as it had been. And it was precisely at this moment, just as things were beginning to turn his way, that the past reached out of the dark and struck at him, and took from him the person he loved most in the world. For there was an old debt of blood hanging over that family, and it had a name, and the name was the Merkit. Long before, when Temujin's father Yasuge was a young raider, he had done a hard thing that was common enough on that steppe, but never forgiven. He had stolen his wife. Holan, Temujin's own mother, the strong woman who had held them all alive, had first been the bride of another man entirely, a Merkit man named Chiladu, who was leading her home across the grass when Yasuge and his brothers rode her down and carried her off, so that Temujin's whole existence began with a theft, with a woman weeping in the arms of one man being taken by another. The Merkit had never forgotten. They had nursed that grievance for a generation, waiting, the way the steppe peoples always waited, for the day the wheel would turn and they could take their revenge. And now, hearing perhaps that the son of Yasuge was still poor and weak, and had just foolishly brought a beautiful bride into his defenceless camp, 300 Merkit horsemen came riding through the dawn to pay the old debt, and to take, in their turn, a woman. Temujin was warned just in time, a servant hearing the drum of hoofs in the ground before first light, and there were not nearly enough horses for everyone, and so in the grey confusion he did the thing that the coldest tellings hold against him, and the kindest tellings simply understand. He mounted his family and fled up into the great sacred mountain. Burkhan Khaldun, the tall forested holy peak where a man could vanish among the trees, and in the scramble and the terror there were not horses enough, and his young wife Borte was left behind. She was hidden in a cart, but they found her, and they took her, and they carried her away north to their own country, and gave her to a Merkit man, the younger brother of that same Chiladu, whose bride had been stolen so long ago, so that the wheel came all the way round, a stolen woman repaid with a stolen woman, a generation late. And Temujin, hidden high on the mountain among the pines while the raiders combed the lower slopes and at last gave up and rode away with his wife, came down when it was safe and did a thing that tells you how deep this cut. He did not rage. He gave thanks. He bared his head and loosened his belt and hung it round his neck in the posture of utter humility, and he bowed to the mountain that had sheltered him 9 times, and he swore that he would honour it every morning of his life and teach his children and his children's children to do the same, for it had saved him when he had nothing. And then, having given his thanks, he set about coldly and steadily the business of getting Borte back. And here, you see, is where all that patient gathering of friends suddenly showed its worth. Because a landless boy cannot make war on a whole tribe to recover one woman, but a young man with a powerful patron and a sworn brother can. Temujin went to Togrul, his father's old Anda, his new-made protector, and reminded him of the bond and of the promise. And Togrul, good as his word, said a fierce and generous thing. For the black sable coat, we will destroy the whole Merkit people and bring your wife back to you, and he pledged an army of 20,000 riders. But he told Temujin to bring in one more ally, a third force, and named the man. And in naming him, he brings onto our stage the figure who will matter, in the end, more than almost anyone in the whole first half of this life. He told Temujin to send for Jamuka. Now I must tell you about Jamuka, gently and with a little sorrow, because his is one of the saddest threads in the whole long story, and it starts here in warmth and ends, far away, in grief. Jamuka was a young Mongol nobleman, high-born, brilliant, dazzlingly charming, a natural leader of men. Everything, on paper, that Temujin was not, for Jamuka had a great clan behind him, and Temujin had almost nothing. And the two of them were not strangers. They had known each other as small boys, playing on the frozen Onon River, and twice already as children they had sworn themselves Anda, sworn brothers, exchanging boyish gifts, a knuckle-bone from a deer, the tips of their arrows, mingling the vow into their play. So when Temujin sent to Jamuka now, in his hour of need, He was not asking a favour of a stranger but calling on the brother of his childhood, and Jamuka answered magnificently. He was stung to real anger on his friend's behalf, spoke great ringing words about tearing the Merkit apart and rescuing the Lady Borte, and brought his own army to join Togrul's. So that 3 forces converged, the old Keret Khan and the brilliant young noble and the landless boy with his handful of companions, all riding north together to fall upon the Merkit. And fall upon them they did, sweeping down in the night on the unsuspecting camps, scattering the 300 who had come for Borte to the 4 winds, and in the middle of the chaos, the fire and the fleeing people and the thunder of it, there is a small perfect moment that the old history preserves, and that I will give you softly. Temujin rode through the rout calling her name Borte, Borte, into the dark and the confusion, and Borte, being dragged along among the fleeing Merkit, heard his voice across all that noise, and knew it, and leapt down and ran toward it, and caught the reins of his horse in the moonlight, and the 2 of them, torn apart by the raid, found each other in the very heart of the battle they had fought to be reunited. He had come for her with an army, and she had come to him through the flames, and they held each other while the fighting rolled away into the night, and the histories say he broke off the pursuit at once, for he had what he had come for, and the rest was only slaughter. Borte came home carrying a child, a son, born not long after, whom they named Jochi, and there hung over that boy, all his life, a soft unanswerable shadow, a question no one could ever settle about the months she had spent among the Merkit, and whose son he truly was. A question that Temujin himself answered, always and firmly, by naming the boy his own, and raising him as his eldest, but which would rise again, quietly and cruelly, near the very end of this story, when the inheritance of the world came to be divided. But that is far away, and it is not for tonight. Tonight the young family is whole again, and the great thing that has just happened is not really the rescue at all, but the alliance that made it possible. For Temujin has now ridden to war beside the 2 most important men of his early life, and won. And out of that shared victory the bond between him and Jamuka flared up into its brightest and most beautiful moment. On the way home, flushed with triumph, the 2 young men swore the under oath a 3rd time, now as grown warriors, in the full and solemn form. They exchanged golden belts and fine horses taken from the Merkit, they feasted together under the trees, and the old history says they lay down to sleep that night under a single blanket, the 2 of them, sworn brothers, closer than kin, loving one another, in the words of the source, with a love that had no thought of any parting. And for a 1.5 years they lived exactly so, side by side, their peoples herding together, their tents pitched together, 2 young lords sharing one life, and if the story ended there, it would be the tenderest tale of friendship on the whole steppe. But it does not end there. It could not. Because the 2 of them, for all their love, wanted, in the end, the same single thing, and there is only ever room for one man at the very top, and slowly, so slowly that neither of them could have named the day it started, the brotherhood began to cool into something else. And it cooled, when it came, over exactly the quality we have been watching all night. It cooled because ordinary people, the poor herders and the masterless men, and the small clan leaders looking about that steppe for someone to follow, kept choosing Temujin. Here were 2 young lords sharing a camp, and one of them, Jamuka, was high-born, proud, a stickler for the old ways in which the great were great, and the low stayed low, a man who used his followers and expected them to know their place. And the other, Temujin, was the poor one, the outsider, and yet there was something about the way he dealt with men that pulled them toward him like water running downhill. He was fair. He shared out the plunder from a raid among the men who had won it, generously, by what they had done rather than by how high they were born, so that a common herdsman who rode well and fought hard might find himself rewarded by Temujin in a way no high-born chief would ever have troubled to reward him. He was loyal to the men who served him, and they felt it, felt that this was a leader who would not throw them away as his own clan had once thrown him away, who remembered a kindness and repaid it and stood by the humble. And so, living there in the shared camp, the herders and the lesser folk began, quietly one family and then another, to drift away from the proud Jamuka and toward the fair-dealing Temujin, and both men saw it, and it opened, between the brothers of the heart, a slow and widening crack. It came to its quiet crisis on a day of moving camp, in a scene so understated that you could almost miss the earthquake in it. The two households were on the march together, as they had been for months, and Jamuka said to Temujin a strange cryptic thing, a riddle really, about where they should pitch that night, murmuring that if they camped up by the mountain the horse herders among them would have their tents, and if they camped down by the stream the shepherds would have their food. Words that seemed to hint that the two of them and their followers should perhaps at last divide, or perhaps meant something sharper still that Temujin could not quite read. And Temujin, uncertain, reined back and let the column go on, and turned to ask the counsel of the women, of his mother Holern, and above all of his wise Borte, and it was Borte who cut straight to the bone of it. Jamuka is quick to tire of things, she said. Quick to tire of people. The words are a sign. Do not camp with him tonight. Let us break away and keep moving through the dark and put distance between us while we can. And Temujin listened to her, as he almost always listened to her, and that night, instead of making camp beside his sworn brother, he kept his people moving, quietly, away, riding on through the darkness and leaving Jamuka behind. And when the word went out that Temujin had broken off and struck out on his own, the most extraordinary thing happened. The thing that had been building for a year and a half, the herders chose. All through that night and the days that followed, family after family, clan after clan, whole groups of Jamuka's own followers and unattached wanderers besides, gathered up their tents and their animals and their children, and came over to Temujin, streaming toward the poor man who dealt fairly and away from the proud one who did not, so that the outsider who had begun with 8 horses now found himself, of a sudden, at the head of a real people, a following gathered to him not by birth or by force, but by simple choice, because he was the one men wanted to follow. And his own circle, the men closest to him, the kinsmen and the early companions, and even some of the older Mongol aristocrats, who saw which way the wind was setting, looked at this gathering of people around Temujin, and made a decision that lifts our chapter to its close. They came to him, the chief men of his following, and they raised him up. They proclaimed him Khan, their Khan, the leader of this new-made people, and they swore great oaths to him, that they would ride at the front of every battle and bring him the fairest women and the finest horses of every raid, that they would round up his herds and hunt down his enemies, and that if ever they disobeyed him in the day of battle or failed him in his need, he might take everything they had and cast their worthless heads out upon the ground. It was the first time. This is not yet the great and famous crowning that gives him his everlasting name, the one that is still years and a whole war away, waiting for us further on. This was smaller and rougher and earlier, a young man hailed as Khan by his own followers out on the open grass, a chief among many chiefs, one lord among the steppe's dozen quarrelling lords. But it was the turning of the whole tide of his life, for the boy who had been thrown away to starve, who had come home with nothing but an iron will, had now been chosen, freely, by other free men, to lead them, and he would never again be nobody. And you can perhaps already feel, softly, the shadow that falls across that bright morning, because there was one man on all that steppe for whom the news of Temujin's rise was not joy, but a wound. One man watching his own followers melt away toward the friend he had loved under a single blanket, and that man was Jamuka, the brother of his heart. The two Anders, sworn 3 times over, bound closer than kin, were now, though neither had yet drawn a blade, the 2 rising powers of the same grassland, and there was not room, on that grass, for both of them to be Khan. But that reckoning belongs to the next part of the story, and there is not the smallest need to reach for it tonight. Let it wait. Let the young Khan sit among his new people in the firelight, freshly raised up, loved and chosen and full of a future he cannot yet see, and let his sworn brother stand off in the dark of the coming years, and let the two of them rest there, still friends, still whole, on the last quiet evening before everything between them changes. There is nothing you need to carry forward. The people are gathered, the boy is a Khan, the grass is wide and dark and peaceful, and you may let it all go soft now. And drift, and we will find them again gently, when we are ready to see how brothers become enemies. And so his own people lifted him up and called him Khan. And the boy who had once run barefoot across the ice, with a wooden collar locked around his neck, stood now at the head of a following of his own. And the hardest thing about that morning was not the enemies who hated him, but the friend who loved him, out there somewhere across the grass, who was going to have to become his enemy too. Let us go gently now into the long middle of the story, the part where Temujin stops being a survivor and becomes, slowly and with a great deal of blood and patience, a conqueror. And let me say to you before we begin that this is the stretch of his life that has the most fighting in it, the most war, the most of what the world usually means when it says his name. And yet, I am going to tell it to you softly, the way I have told you everything else, because you are not here tonight to be frightened. You are here to be carried. And the wars are all 2 great and quiet centuries behind us, and none of the men in them can reach you where you are lying now. So let the fighting be far off, like weather on the other side of a mountain, something you can hear but do not have to stand out in. And let us walk through these years the way you might walk through a gallery of old paintings, pausing where we like, moving on when we please, in no hurry at all. It began, as the deepest wounds so often do, between the two who had loved each other best. You will remember Jamuka, the bright and charming companion of Temujin's boyhood, the Anda, the sworn brother, the one with whom he had twice exchanged the solemn oath and the gifts of knuckle bones and arrows, the friend he had ridden beside and slept beside and shared a single blanket with under the winter stars. For 1.5 years after the rescue of Borte, the two of them had lived together as one people, their followers mingled, their herds grazing the same valleys, and it had been, by every sign we can still read, a happy time. But 2 suns cannot share one sky, and slowly, the way a small crack runs quietly through a frozen lake before anyone hears it, the friendship had begun to divide. The herders and the poor men and the younger sons kept drifting toward Temujin, toward his open hand and his fair division of the spoils, and the strange warmth of a man who remembered the names of those who served him. And Jamuka, who was of the old high blood and believed in the old high order, watched them go with a growing coldness. And then came the day, told in the oldest of the Mongol accounts in words that have puzzled people ever since, when the two of them were moving camp together, and Jamuka said a single strange sentence about where they should pitch. Something about the horse herders and the shepherds, and who should camp by the mountain and who by the stream, and Borte, hearing it, told her husband quietly that it was time to part from the Anda, that the words had a hidden meaning, and the meaning was not friendship. And Temujin, who trusted her judgment more than his own, gave the order in the dark, and his people struck their tents in the night and pulled away, and by morning the 2 brothers of the heart were travelling apart, and the long friendship was over, and the long war had begun. It came to open blows before very long, and the first time the 2 armies met, Temujin lost. I want you to hear that plainly, and without any alarm, because it is one of the truest and most comforting things about this whole long life, that the man the world remembers as the great unbeaten conqueror was beaten, more than once, early on, and did not let it finish him. The battle is remembered by a place name, the Field of the 70 Marshes, and there Jamuka, with a great host of the proud clans gathered behind him, drove Temujin's smaller force from the ground and scattered it back into the hills. It should have been the end of him. And here is the thing that turned it, the strange thing, the thing that tells you how this whole story is really going to go. Jamuka, flushed with his victory and wishing to make an example that would terrify anyone who thought of following the upstart, did a terrible thing to his captives. The accounts say he had 70 great cauldrons set up and boiled his prisoners alive in them, and cut off the head of a captured chief and dragged it behind his horse. And whatever the exact truth of that grim picture, the effect of it is not in doubt. for the cruelty did not frighten men toward Jamukha, it frightened them away from him. Clan after clan, hearing what the victor had done, quietly decided that they would rather throw in their lot with the man who had lost the battle than with the man who had won it and then behaved like that. And in the weeks and months after his defeat, Temujin found his following not shrinking but swelling, as whole groups of herdsmen rode over to him out of the camps of his enemies. He had lost the field and gained the war without lifting his hand, simply by being the kind of man that beaten and frightened people wanted to belong to. Hold that softly, because it is the secret of everything that follows. Now the years move on, and I am going to let them move, because a life is long and a night is finite, and we need not stand on every single field. Temujin grew patiently, gathering strength, and he kept always at his back the one great alliance that had lifted him from nothing. His bond with Togrul, the old and powerful Khan of the Keret people, the man who had been his dead father's sworn friend, and who had taken the young Temujin under his wing as a kind of foster son. Togrul was the most powerful ruler on the steppe in those years. A Christian of the old Eastern kind, shrewd and much betrayed and much restored, a survivor of 100 palace quarrels, and for a long time he and Temujin rode together as elder and younger, patron and rising man, and between them they were strong enough to begin settling the great old scores. And the oldest score of all, the one that had lain in Temujin's heart since he was 9 years old, was with the Tatars. You have not forgotten the Tatars, and neither had he. They were the people who had given his father the poisoned cup at the feast on the road, the ones whose slow murder of Yasuge had thrown the boy and his mother and his little brothers out onto the empty grass to starve. For all the years of his growing up and his rising, that debt had waited, and now at last the chance to collect it came, and it came from a strange direction, from the great settled empire far to the south, for down beyond the edge of the grasslands lay China, or rather the northern part of it, ruled in those days by a dynasty called the Jin, and the Jin, like all settled empires with a wild frontier, spent their strength trying to keep the tribes of the steppe divided and quarrelling, so that none should ever grow strong enough to come over the wall. And in that year the Tatars had grown too strong and too troublesome for the Jin, and the Jin sent an army north to break them, and they called on the steppe Khans to help. And Togrul answered the call, and Temujin answered it beside him, and the two of them fell upon the Tatars from the north, while the Jin pressed them from the south. And between the hammer and the anvil the old enemy was crushed. Temujin took a rich plunder that day, a silver cradle and a coverlet sewn with pearls, small gleaming things out of the tents of the people who had murdered his father, and the Jin, grateful, gave him a modest border title, a small honourable word that meant something like commander of the frontier, the first recognition the wider world ever gave him. The boy from the starving camp had been noticed, at last, by an emperor. But it is what he did after the victory, and not the victory itself, that I want you to carry, because it is here that you first see clearly the thing that set him apart from every other war leader of his age. When a steppe army beat an enemy tribe in the old way, it plundered them and scattered them and enslaved a few, and let the rest melt back into the grass to nurse their hatred and rise again in a generation. Temujin did something else. He gathered his own kinsmen and captains in council before the fighting, and they agreed on a hard new rule, that no man was to stop and plunder while the battle was undecided, that all the spoil was to be gathered together afterward and shared out fairly by his command, and that a beaten enemy was not to be simply looted and left. And with the defeated Tatars he went further still, into a thing so cold that the accounts still shudder at it. For the story says he decreed that the grown men of the Tatar fighting clans, the ones tall enough to stand higher than the linchpin of a cartwheel, should be put to the sword, so that the tribe as a rival power should cease forever to exist. Let me not dwell on that, for it is a dark thing, and there is no need to look at it long. Let it pass by in the dark like a cold wind, and be gone. But hear the other half of it, the half that matters for the future, because he did not destroy the Tatar people. He took their women and their children and their young ones into his own household and his own following, distributed among his families, raised as Mongols, married to his men. He even took 2 Tatar sisters into his own tent as wives, and one of them he came to love and trust above almost anyone. The rival nation he ended, the human beings he absorbed. And that was the pattern, the strange and terrible and effective pattern, that he would use again and again on his long road to mastery. He did not leave defeated enemies behind him to hate him. He dissolved them and folded them into himself, until in time there was hardly anyone left on the steppe who was outside of him. And now we come to the saddest of the ruptures, sadder even than the parting from Jamuka, because it fell between Temujin and the old man who had been almost a father to him. For as Temujin grew greater, year by year, the balance between him and his patron Togrul began, quietly to shift. The younger man was no longer the grateful foster son with a handful of followers. He had become a power in his own right, with captains and clans, and a name that men spoke with respect and fear. And around the old Khan there gathered a crowd of jealous voices, whispering that the young eagle they had all helped to raise would one day eat them. Chief among those voices was Togrul's own son, a proud and resentful man named Sengum, who looked at Temujin and saw a rival for his father's throne, and could not bear him. And there was Jamuka too, the old Ander, the boyhood friend turned enemy, who had drifted at last into Togrul's camp, and who worked upon the old man and his son with all his considerable charm and all his considerable poison, telling them exactly what they already feared, that Temujin was not to be trusted, that he was only waiting his moment, that he must be struck down before he grew any stronger. The break, when it came through a marriage, as breaks so often did on the steppe. Temujin, hoping to bind the 2 houses together forever, proposed that his eldest son should marry Togrul's daughter, and that a daughter of his should marry Sengum's son, a double knot of the 2 families' blood. And Sengum, in his pride, was insulted by it, feeling that Temujin's house was reaching above itself, and the proposal was refused in a way that could not be mistaken for anything but contempt. And out of that refusal, the whole conspiracy took its shape. They resolved to be rid of him, and they laid a trap, a soft one, an invitation. They sent word that they had reconsidered the marriage after all, and that Temujin should come to the betrothal feast to seal it, come with only a small escort, as a guest, as family. And Temujin, unsuspecting, set out with a few men toward what was meant to be his death. It was only by the barest chance that he was saved. He stopped for the night at the tents of a humble herdsman along the way, and there, in the dark, 2 brothers who tended the horses fell to talking as they worked, and one of them let slip what he had overheard, that on the morrow the guest riding to the feast was to be surrounded and killed, and the brothers, in a decision that turned the whole history of the world, chose to warn the stranger rather than let him ride blind to his end. They saddled their fastest horses and rode through the night to Temujin's camp and told him everything, and he broke camp at once and fled, and the trap closed on empty grass. There was no avoiding the war now, and it went badly at first, as so many of the turning points of his life went badly at first. The Karit came against him in force, and near a place remembered as the Red Willows. At a spot the accounts call Kalakaljit's Sons, Temujin's outnumbered men fought a desperate and bloody battle against his old protector's army, and were beaten and driven from the field. His 3rd son was wounded in the neck by an arrow, and one of his most faithful captains, a man named Gelmi, sat by the boy through the freezing night, sucking the clotted blood from the wound and spitting it away, keeping the young man alive by the fire until dawn. Temujin fled eastward with only a remnant, a shattered handful of the men who had followed him, hungry and hunted, all the way to the shores of a muddy little lake or river called the Baljuna, at the far dry edge of everything, about as low and as beaten as he had been since the days of his boyhood. And here, at this lowest point, comes one of the most beloved moments in the whole Mongol memory of him, a quiet moment worth resting on. For there by that muddy water, with almost nothing left, the small band of men who had stayed with him through the ruin, only a few dozen of them, of many different tribes and many different faiths. Some Christians and some Muslims, and some who worshipped the old sky, drank together from the same brackish water of the Baljuna, and swore an oath to stand by him to the end, whatever came. And ever afterward those men were honoured above all others, the Baljuna companions, the ones who had been there in the mud when there was nothing left to gain by loyalty, but loyalty itself. And it was said that a man who had drunk the Baljuna water could ask his lord for almost anything. Let that be a small warm light in the middle of the dark part of the story, that even at his most beaten, he was the kind of man for whom a few good people would drink muddy water and swear to die. And from that low place he rose again, and he rose by cunning as much as by strength. His enemies, the Keriot, thought him finished, scattered, no longer worth watching, and they relaxed, and set to feasting and quarrelling among themselves in the careless way of people who believe they have already won. And Temujin, watching from far off, gathered his strength quietly and learned exactly where the old Khan's great camp lay, and then he did the thing he did best. He struck when no one expected it. He led his men on a hard secret ride, day and night, and fell upon the Keriot camp without warning while they were at their ease, and surrounded them, and fought them for 3 days and 3 nights, until the whole great confederation of the most powerful people on the steppe simply came apart in his hands. Dogrul, the old Khan, the almost father, fled the wreck of his own power alone into the western hills, and there, not knowing him, a border guard of the Naiman killed him as a ragged trespasser, and did not believe, when the dead man's face was brought back, that this could really be the great Ong Khan, who had ruled the eastern grasslands for 40 years. So ended the man who had lifted Temujin up, and then turned against him, killed by a stranger who took him for a nobody, and Temujin, they say, grieved for him even as he swallowed his people. And swallow them he did, in his usual way, not scattering the beaten Keriot, but taking them wholesale into his own following, parcelling their clans out among his commanders, marrying their princesses into his own family, so that the great Keriot nation, which had been his rival that spring, was by autumn simply part of him. Defeat once again had become absorption. Now there was only one great power left on the grass that stood outside of Temujin, and it lay far off in the west, and it was the strongest and the proudest of them all, and it was the Naiman. Let me set the scene for you gently, because this is the last of the great tribal wars, and the one that finished the work. The Naiman were a large and cultured people of the far western mountains and steppes, more touched by the settled world than the eastern tribes, with a king called the Tayang Khan, a soft and hesitant man ruling a hard and warlike nation. And around him now gathered every scattered enemy that Temujin had made in all his long rise. For as Temujin swallowed the steppe tribe by tribe, all the beaten and the frightened and the proud, who would not bow to him, fled westward to the one court still strong enough to shelter them, the broken remnants of the Merkit and the Tatars and the Keriot, the wild free clans who loved no master, and among them, restless and homeless and still burning, the old Ender himself, Jamuka, drifting like a ghost from one lord's camp to the next, always against Temujin, always whispering, never quite able to stop. The Tayang Khan, urged on by his fierce mother and his warlike son, and by all these bitter exiles, resolved at last to crush the eastern upstart before he grew any greater, and he sent out word for the great gathering of all the enemies of Temujin, and the two halves of the steppe drew together for the battle that would decide who was to rule it all. And in the way he prepared for that battle you can see the whole difference between the two men, and between the old steppe and the new thing he was making of it. Temujin's army was smaller, and its horses were thin after the year's campaigning, and to hide his weakness and unsettle his enemy he ordered every man to light 5 separate campfires at night, spread wide across the hills, so that the Naiman scouts looking east saw the darkness filled with more fires than there were stars, and reported that the Mongol host was beyond counting. And when the armies at last drew near, the Tayang Khan, timid and uncertain, wished to draw back and lure the Mongols deep into his own country and wear them down before fighting. which was sound enough advice. But his own son and his own captains mocked him for a coward until, shamed, he agreed to stand and fight in the open, which was exactly what Temujin wanted. And Jamuka, riding with the Naiman, watched Temujin's disciplined columns come on in their good order, rank behind rank, and he named the great captains to the frightened Tayang Khan one by one. The 4 hounds of Temujin fed on human flesh with foreheads of bronze and tongues like awls, and the more he described the terrible order of his old friend's army, the more the Naiman king's courage drained out of him, until Jamuka, in a strange half-treacherous pity, or perhaps only wishing his old Anda to win after all, quietly pulled his own men out of the line and rode away, sending word to Temujin that the enemy was already beaten in his heart. And so it proved. The battle, fought on the slopes of a mountain the accounts call Naku, was less a battle than a destruction. The disciplined Mongol columns broke the great disordered Naiman host and drove it up the mountainside in the dark, and the panicked men, crowding backward in the night, fell from the cliffs and crushed one another in the ravines until, it was said, their bones piled up like fallen timber. The Tayang Khan was mortally wounded and died, bewildered, still not quite understanding how it had happened, and his proud nation was shattered in a single day. And the Naiman, too, in their turn, were folded into the growing body of Temujin's people, and with them, quietly, came a gift more lasting than any plunder, for among the captured officials of the Naiman court was a learned scribe, who kept the king's seal and knew how to write, and from him Temujin took the first written script his people had ever had, and the first notion of keeping records and issuing sealed decrees, so that even in this last of the tribal wars the conqueror gained not only soldiers, but the beginnings of a state. But that belongs to the chapter after this one, set it aside for now. There remained only the ghost, only Jamuka. The old Anda, the sworn brother of the boy Temujin had been, was a hunted fugitive now, his followers gone, wandering the western hills with the last few companions, hiding, moving, growing hungry, a hunted king of nothing at all. And in the end it was his own last companions who finished it, for those few remaining men, seeing no future in starving beside a lost cause, seized Jamuka one day and bound him and carried him to Temujin, thinking to buy their own lives and a reward with the body of their lord. And here the story gives you, at its very end, one more clear look at the strange code by which Temujin lived. He did not thank the men who betrayed their master. He was disgusted by them, as Caesar had been disgusted long before by the men who brought him Pompey's head, and he had these betrayers put to death before Jamuka's eyes, ruling that a man who would raise his hand against his own rightful lord could never be trusted by anyone, and did not deserve to live. And then he turned to Jamuka, the friend of his childhood, the brother of the exchanged oaths, the enemy of his whole manhood, and, the story says, he offered him his life. He offered to be brothers again, to be joined once more as they had been under the single blanket, to have Jamuka ride at his side and be a great man in the new world that was coming. It is one of the tenderest and most sorrowful passages in all the long account. The 2 old Anda speaking to each other across everything that had happened, and Jamuka, worn out and clear-eyed, refused there could not be 2 suns in one sky, he said. He had made his choice long ago and lost. And a beaten rival left alive would only be a splinter forever working under Temujin's skin, a source of trouble to the very end. He asked only for the honourable death of a nobleman, a death without the spilling of his blood upon the ground, as their old custom held for the killing of the highborn, and Temujin, grieving, granted it to him, and had him put to death without shedding his blood, and buried with honour. And so the last rival of his youth was gone, and the boy who had shared his bread and his blanket long ago went into the earth by the hand of the friend who could not, in the end, find any way to keep him alive and safe at once. Let that grief be gentle, the way all these old griefs are gentle now, worn smooth by 800 years, a sadness you can hold in your hand like a cool stone and then set down. And now, at last, look up, softly, and see what he had done. Turn slowly all the way around in your mind and look out across the whole vast sea of grass, from the forests of the north to the deserts of the south, from the eastern rivers where he was born to the western mountains where the Naiman had fallen, and understand that all of it, every valley and every clan and every wandering camp, was now for the first time in the memory of any living person under a single hand. The Tatars who had poisoned his father were part of him. The Merkit who had stolen his wife were part of him. The Kerit of his old lost patron were part of him, and the Naiman and the Taichiud who had once locked the wooden collar around his boyish neck. All of them. All the proud old separate nations that had feuded and raided and murdered across that grass since before anyone could remember were dissolved now and remade and knit together into one enormous people that had never existed before. And it was his. He had done it not merely by winning battles, for many men had won battles, but by that one strange and patient genius that had run through everything from the very beginning, that he broke the beaten tribes apart and would not let them stay themselves, mixing their clans, scattering their old loyalties, and folding their fighting men into his own army by the 10 and the 100 and the 1,000, promoting them not by the blood they were born with, but by the courage and the faithfulness they showed him, so that a poor man of a conquered enemy tribe could rise to command thousands if only he served well. And a high-born prince who betrayed his lord would die in the dirt. He had made loyalty and merit the only bloodlines that counted, and in doing so he had taken the endless quarrel of the steppe, the thing that had orphaned him and starved him and hunted him all his life, and he had simply ended it, by making everyone, at last, one. And there we will stop, gently, on the very edge of the thing, the way we always stop just before the door. For a great gathering was being called, out on the banks of the river where he had been born, a meeting of all the peoples of the grass, to set the seal upon what he had made, and to give it, and him, a name that the world would never afterward forget. But that lies just over the horizon of tonight, and there is no need to cross to it yet. Let the wars be over, let the grass be quiet, let the countless fires of the united camps burn low and orange across the whole dark steppe under the enormous wheel of the northern stars, and let the man who had come up out of nothing at all, out of the frozen river and the wooden collar and the starving camp, stand for one long, peaceful moment at the head of a nation that had never before existed, not yet crowned, not yet named, only quietly, completely, master of his world. And let yourself, wherever you are, rest there with him in that stillness, with nothing more to hold and nothing more to fear, because the fighting is finished and the naming can wait, and it will all still be here, patient and unhurried, whenever you are ready to come back and see him crowned. And so the killing is over, at last, and the great grassland lies quiet. For the first time in longer than the oldest herdsman can remember, there is no rival warband riding somewhere out beyond the next line of hills, no old enemy nursing a grudge in a far valley, no tribe left standing apart with its own banner and its own proud name. The Tatars are gone, folded into the whole. The Kerit are gone, their people scattered among the tents of the victors. The Naiman in the west are broken and quiet, and the last rival of his youth is dead. And the man who did all of this, the outcast boy who once fled starving across the snow with a wooden collar around his neck, is now simply the only power left under the wide sky. Let that settle for a moment, the way the dust settles on the steppe after the horses have passed, slowly, softly, drifting down through the long slant of evening light and coming to rest. There is nothing left to conquer here. There is only the great question of what to do with a peace that no one alive has ever seen before, and there is no hurry at all, none to answer it. We have all the time in the world. It is the spring of the year we call 1206, and the people are gathering. They are coming in from everywhere across that enormous emptiness, from the cold pine forests in the north and the dry grass in the south, from the foot of the Altai Mountains and the shores of the great salt lakes, coming in slow winding columns of horses and carts and driven herds, the felt tents lashed down on the ox wagons and the children riding high on the loads and the sheep and the goats, and the horses moving in their thousands alongside, raising a haze of pale dust that hangs for miles in the clean spring air. They are coming to a bend of a certain river, the Onon, the same river along whose banks this man was born, more than 40 years before, in a world that no longer exists, a world of endless feud and raid and midnight murder that he himself has swept away, and they are coming to make him something that the steppe has never truly had before, not a chief of one clan, not a Khan of one people, but a single ruler set over all of them at once, over every tribe and every tongue, the first and only lord of a nation that did not exist the day before yesterday, and now suddenly does. Picture the place as it must have looked, and let the picture be slow and wide. A broad green plain by the river, still soft and new with spring grass, and across it, as far as the eye can travel, the white tents standing in their ordered ranks, thousands upon thousands of them, more people in one place than most of these herders have seen in their whole lives put together, the smoke of countless fires rising straight up in the still morning, the endless soft noise of a great host at rest, the murmur of talk, the bleat of animals, the ring of a hammer somewhere, a horse calling to another horse across the camp. And somewhere near the heart of it a tall standard has been raised, the Suld, the great banner of the new ruler, made of a long shaft hung about with the flowing white tail hair of the finest stallions, 9 tails together, pale and streaming in the wind off the river, a thing his people believe holds the very spirit and luck of the nation gathered up into it. Under that white banner, in front of all the assembled tribes, they are going to give him his name. They call the gathering a Kurultai, a great assembly, a coming together of all the important men of all the peoples, and it is at once a festival and a council, and a solemn act of making. There is feasting, of course, whole herds slaughtered and roasting, great skins of fermented mare's milk passed and drunk, wrestling and horse racing and the shooting of arrows. The whole steppe in one long open-air celebration. But at its centre there is a single grave purpose. The shamans, the holy men who speak to the sky, come forward and declare that the eternal blue heaven itself, the Tengri, the great sky that arches over everything, has chosen this man and set him above all others, that his rule is not merely the outcome of his own long fighting, but the will of heaven made plain. And then, before them all, they proclaim him by a new title, a title that lifts him clear out of the ordinary run of Khans and chieftains. They call him Genghis Khan. Say it softly to yourself in the dark, the way the grass must have carried it that day from mouth to mouth across the plain. Genghis Khan. No one is entirely certain, even now, exactly what the word was meant to mean, and there is something fitting in that, something that suits a man who came out of nowhere to stand over the whole world. Some say it means the fierce or the hard ruler, the unbending one, but the meaning that has stayed, the one that seems to catch the size of the thing, is grander and stranger than that. It is thought to come from a word close to the Mongolian word for the ocean, for the sea. And so his title is often given to us as the oceanic ruler, or the universal ruler, the lord whose dominion is as wide as the sea itself, as wide as the great sky overhead, the ruler of all that lies between the waters, the ruler, in the end, of everything. Which is a remarkable name to give a man who has at this moment never in his life so much as seen the sea, whose whole world is grass and horses and open sky, and who has never yet marched an army beyond the edge of the steppe. It is a name that is not a description of what he has done. It is a promise of what he is going to do. And you and I, lying here in the quiet, already know that the promise is going to be kept. But here is the thing that matters, the thing that is easy to miss under all the banners and the feasting and the great-sounding name, and it is the real subject of this chapter. So let us slow right down and take it gently, one piece at a time, the way you might lay out the parts of some fine and complicated thing on a soft cloth to look at them in the lamplight. Naming a man the ruler of all the tribes does not, by itself, make the tribes into a nation. For 1,000 years and more, The steppe had thrown up great conquerors before, strong men who gathered the clans by the sheer force of their own fighting and their own charm, and every single time, the moment that strong man died, or even sometimes the moment he simply grew old. The whole thing had come apart again in his hands, the tribes falling back into their old names and their old feuds, the confederation dissolving like frost in the morning sun. Genghis Khan had seen this. He had lived it. He knew, better than anyone had ever known it, how quickly a nation of horsemen could crumble back into a scatter of quarrelling herdsmen. And so the truly astonishing thing he did in the years around that assembly on the On was not the winning of the war at all. It was what he built afterward to make sure the peace would hold. He set about, patiently and deliberately, taking a raiders' confederation and turning it into a machine, a state, a thing that could run on after him and outlast him, and he did it with a handful of quiet, powerful ideas. The first of them was the way he arranged his people, and it was so simple that its simplicity is almost the whole secret of it. He took the entire nation, every family and every fighting man in it, and he organized them not by their tribe, not by their bloodline, not by the old names they had been born to, but by plain counting, by tens. 10 men made the smallest unit, a squad, a little band who lived and rode and fought together, an arban. 10 of those tens made a company of 100, a jagan. 10 hundreds made 1,000, a minghan, and 10,000 men together made the largest unit of all, a tumen, a division of the army complete in itself. Tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s stacked one inside the other as neatly as a set of nested bowls, so that the great sprawling host became a single ordered structure that a commander could reach down into and move about at will. A message or an order could pass from the top of it clean down to the bottom in a matter of moments, from the ruler to the 10,000 to the 1,000 to the 100 to the 10 to the single man on his single horse, and back up again the same way. And notice, because this is the gentle radical heart of it, what the counting did to the old world of the tribes. When Genghis Khan broke a defeated people, he did not let them stay together as a people. He took them apart and he sprinkled them through the tens and the hundreds, mixing Tatar with Keret, with Naiman, with Mongol, so that the old tribal loyalties, the very things that had torn the steppe to pieces over and over for centuries, were quietly dissolved. A man no longer belonged first to his clan. He belonged to his 10, to the 9 other men who rode at his side, men who might have been his enemies a year before and were now bound to him for life. Because in this new order the whole 10 were held answerable for each other. If one man fled a battle and left his comrades, all 10 could be punished. If one 10 failed, the 100 above it answered for it, and so every man had reason, every hour of every day, to hold fast to the men beside him, and the 1,000 old fault lines of blood and tribe were welded over into one solid thing. It is one of the quietest and most powerful ideas any conqueror ever had, and he simply drew it out across the whole of his world as calmly as a herdsman counting sheep. Now let the fire burn a little lower, and let us look at the next piece. Because at the very centre of this ordered nation, he set a thing to guard it, and to grow its leaders, and it was called the Keshig. The Keshig was his own bodyguard, his household guard, an elite corps of chosen men who watched over his tent and his person day and night. The day guard and the night guard turning and turning about, so that the ruler was never for one moment unwatched. But it was far more than a set of soldiers standing at a door. To be taken into the Keshig was the highest honour a young man in the whole nation could be given, and its ranks were filled with the sons of his commanders and his nobles, brought in close, brought in under his own eye. And there, in the daily service of guarding him and running his household and riding at his back, those young men were watched and tested and trained, learning the whole art of leadership at the very shoulder of the master, so that the Keshig became not only a shield but a school, a nursery of officers, a place from which he could draw tried and trusted men to send out and command his thousands. And his 10,000s. A single guardsman of the Kashig ranked, in the order of things, above even the commander of 1,000 men out in the army, because the ruler knew these men, personally, and trusted them, and that trust was worth more to him than any inherited rank. Which brings us gently to the deepest of all his rules, the one that ran underneath everything else like water under grass, and it was this. He promoted men for their loyalty and their ability, and for nothing else. Not for their birth, not for the greatness of their fathers, not for the old proud names of their clans. In the world he had been born into, a man's whole life was fixed by his blood. The highborn led, and the lowborn followed, and it had always been so, and always would be. But Genghis Khan, remember, was a man whom the highborn had betrayed. His own clan had abandoned him and his mother to starve on the open grass when he was a helpless boy. The proud and the well-born had again and again been the ones who failed him, and the ones who had stood by him, who had ridden to him in his hard early years and given him their loyalty when he had nothing to offer in return, had very often been ordinary men, herders and hunters and the sons of no one in particular. And he did not forget it. Some of his greatest generals, the men he trusted with whole armies, had begun as humble figures, a simple herdsman here, the son of a poor family there, one of them, it is said, a man he had first met as a captive, an enemy who had wounded his horse in battle and then told him the truth about it to his face, and whom he raised for that honesty to the very top of his army. In his nation, a shepherd's son who was brave and faithful and clever could rise to command 10,000 riders, while a prince who was idle or treacherous could be cast down to nothing. This alone made his people something new under the sky, a nation where a man's worth was measured by what he did rather than by who his father had been, and it bound the whole of them to him with bands of iron, because every ordinary man in the host now knew that the road upward was open to him, that his own courage might carry him as far as courage could go. So there is the frame of the nation, the counting and the guard, and the great open ladder of merit. But a nation is not held together by its soldiers alone, and this is where the story grows quieter still, and to my mind, more wonderful, because the instruments he reached for next were softer ones, made not of iron but of ideas, and they are the tools, not of a raider, but of a builder of states. Settle in for these, let your breathing slow to match them. The first was a way of carrying word across the enormous distances of his world, and he built it as a great chain of stations, and it was called the Yam. Across the whole width of the grassland, along the routes that men and messages needed to travel, he set down way stations at regular intervals, roughly a day's hard ride apart, and at each one he kept fresh horses always ready, and food, and shelter, and men to tend them. A rider carrying a message for the ruler could gallop his horse flat out from one station to the next, and there, without stopping to rest, simply hand off his message and leap onto a fresh fast horse, or hand it to a new rider entirely, who would carry it on to the next station and the next, so that word could fly across the steppe in relays, day and night, faster than any single horse and rider could ever have borne it. A message that would have taken weeks to cross that country could now cross it in days. It meant that the ruler, sitting in his tent, could know what was happening at the far edges of his world while it was still nearly fresh, and could send his commands out to the ends of the earth and have them arrive in time to matter. The Yam was the nervous system of the whole nation, the thing that let a single mind govern an empire the size of a continent, threads of galloping horses stitching the vast emptiness together into one living body. Picture those riders, if you like, as you drift, small dark figures far out on the moonlit grass, leaning low over the necks of their horses, carrying word from one warm-lit station to the next, all through the quiet night, so that the nation could sleep. And then there was the matter of writing, for here is a thing you might not have guessed, that the Mongols, when Genghis Khan came to power, had no written language at all. They were a people entirely of the spoken word, of songs and sayings and long recited memories, and everything they knew was carried only in their heads. And you cannot truly run a state on memory alone. You cannot send exact orders across a continent, or keep track of who owns what and who owes what, or set down laws that will hold firm after the men who made them are dead, without some way of fixing words down so they stay fixed. Genghis Khan understood this, and so, when his armies took the Naiman in the west, and among the captives was a learned man, a keeper of records who served the beaten Khan, and who wrote in the graceful script of the Uyghur people to the south, the ruler did not treat that scholar as spoil to be discarded. He kept him. He set him to work, and he ordered that the Uyghur letters be borrowed and fitted to the sounds of the Mongol tongue, so that for the first time in all their long history his people could write down their own language. That borrowed alphabet, running in tall columns down the page, became the first Mongol script, and with it his clerks could now keep his records, register his people, carry his exact words to distant commanders, and set his decrees into a form that could outlast a single human life. A nation of herders learned, almost overnight, to read and to write. And what did he set down first in those new letters? Among the very first things was his law, the great code that we know by the name Yasa. Now much about the Yasa is lost to us, hidden in the mists, for the master copy of it was kept secret, treasured in the ruler's own treasury, and read only by the highest of his family, and no full copy of it has ever come down to our own day. But we know the shape of it, and the shape of it tells us everything. It was a single body of law, one law for the whole nation, binding on everyone from the lowest herdsman all the way up to the ruler's own sons, and this was itself a new and steadying thing, for it meant that a man's fate no longer hung on the whim of whatever chieftain happened to hold him, but on rules that were the same everywhere and for everyone. It set down what was forbidden and what was owed. It punished theft and the stealing of animals and treachery and the breaking of a sworn word harshly, so that a merchant, it was later said, could travel the whole width of that once lawless steppe with a sack of gold and never fear a robber. It regulated the army and the hunt and the ordinary dealings of people with one another. It gave the nation a spine of order that no strong ruler's death could snap. Where once every valley had its own custom and its own feud, now there was one law, written down, standing over all. And there is one more of these soft instruments, and it is perhaps the most surprising and the most gracious of them all, and we will let it be the last thing we lay out here before we rest. Genghis Khan, this hard man of war, made it a firm principle of his new state that all faiths were to be free. In a world where men so often slaughtered one another over the names of their gods, he decreed that within his nation no religion should be forced on anyone and none should be forbidden, that the shaman who spoke to the eternal sky, and the Buddhist with his prayers, and the Muslim at his devotions, and the Christian of the Eastern churches, and every other seeker after heaven, might all worship as they pleased and be equal under his law. The holy men of every faith were freed from taxes and from ordinary service, and were asked in return only to pray for the ruler and his house to whatever god they knew. Whether he did this out of a genuine wideness of spirit, or out of a shrewd sense that a ruler who leaves men their gods keeps their loyalty far more cheaply than one who tries to take them away, or most likely, out of both at once, the result was the same. It bound peoples of a dozen different beliefs peaceably into one nation, and it let that nation swell and swell without tearing itself apart on the sharp edges of faith. It was for its time a thing almost without equal in the world, this quiet tolerance decreed by a conqueror, and it is one of the reasons his empire, when it came, could hold so many different kinds of people under one open sky. And so, look at what he has made, there on the banks of the Onon, in the first years of his great name. A scattering of feuding herdsmen, who a single lifetime before had been busy murdering one another over stolen horses and old insults, has become a single nation, and not merely a nation, but a state, a real and working thing, with an army ordered by tens and hundreds and thousands, and a guard that is also a school for its leaders, and a great open road by which any brave man might rise, and a chain of galloping stations carrying word to its farthest edge, and letters in which to write down its memory, and one firm law standing over all of it, and a wide peace among all its gods. The Raiders' confederation is gone. In its place stands something disciplined and literate and law-bound and stitched together so cunningly that it will not this time come apart when its maker's hand is lifted from it. He has taken the loose sand of the steppe and, without anyone quite seeing how, has turned it to stone. And now the machine is built, and it is idle, and it is very, very strong, and it is standing there in the spring sunlight of the year 1206, with nothing left on the whole steppe to test it against. Every rival is beaten. Every tribe is folded in. The great sky has given him his name, and his people have given him their law, and there is not one enemy left within the ring of the horizon. But a thing like this, a thing so sharp and so ordered and so hungry, does not stay idle for long. Beyond the southern grass, beyond the edge of the world he has spent his whole life mastering, lie the walled cities and the rich fields and the ancient crowded kingdoms of the settled peoples. Kingdoms that have looked down for 1,000 years on the poor rough horsemen of the north as little more than a nuisance on the edge of the map. They do not yet know his new name, they do not yet know what has been assembled, so quietly, up on the cold plateau above them. But we will not go there tonight. Tonight we will leave him just here, at the very summit of his own country. The outcast boy become the oceanic ruler, standing under the 9 white tails of his banner, with a whole nation ordered at his back, looking for the first time in his life, outward, toward the south, toward the wide world beyond the grass. Let him stand there. There is no hurry to follow his gaze. We have, as always, all the time in the world. And so the nation was made, there on the banks of the Onon, whole and single where before there had been only the blowing dust of 100 quarrelling clans. And the man who had made it stood now at the head of a thing the grasslands had never once seen in all their long emptiness, a single people bound, not by blood but by law, ordered patiently into their tens and their hundreds and their thousands and their 10,000s, able to fling a word 1,000 miles across the sea of grass by the fresh horses of the Yam, able to write that word down for the first time in their own hooked and borrowed script, held fast by the code called the Yassa, and by the plain hard promise that loyalty would be lifted up and rewarded, and that treachery would find no shelter anywhere on the earth. It was a magnificent thing, this new nation, and it was also, if you turned it over gently in the cold clear light of morning, a dangerous thing, because a machine built as carefully as that one cannot simply be set down in the grass and left to stand still. An army so ordered, so hungry, so proud of itself, and so freshly made, is like a great drawn bow, and a drawn bow wants, in the end, to be loosed. And so we come tonight to the moment when the bow was drawn back at last and turned outward, away from the steppe that had made it, toward the wide rich settled lands to the south and the east, and the outcast boy who had once starved on the open grass with a wooden collar locked about his neck lifted his eyes, for the first time in his life, toward the walled cities of the world. But let that wait a moment, softly, the way the good things always can. Settle yourself first. Let the lamp burn low and let the room go warm around you, and let your breath run slow and easy, because there is nothing tonight you have to carry, and nowhere at all you have to be. We are going to watch a nation of horsemen learn, slowly and against all likelihood, how to break down the walls of the richest kingdoms on earth, and it is a strange and enormous story, but there is no hurry in it anywhere, and you may follow every turn of it, or you may let it blur soft and warm into sleep, and either one is exactly right. The story will keep. It has kept for 800 years, and it will keep for you. Here is the thing you have to understand about that new-made army, the thing that shaped everything it did. It was an army of the open grass, and it knew in its bones and its hands exactly one kind of war. It knew the war of the horse and the bow, the war of the flat wide land where nothing stands in your way, where you can wheel and gallop and pour your arrows into an enemy at full flight and vanish over the rim of the world before he can close with you. On that kind of ground the Mongols were, quite simply, the finest soldiers who had ever lived. Every man among them had ridden almost before he could walk, could shoot a bow from a galloping horse and hit a bird on the wing, could live for days on a little dried curd and a mouthful of mare's milk, and the blood of his own mount opened at a vein and closed again, could go where no supply wagon could ever follow, because his food and his home and his transport all walked along beside him on 4 legs and asked for nothing but grass. Against any army that would meet them out in the open, they were almost impossible to beat. But the rich lands to the south were not open at all. The rich lands were a country of walls. Everywhere a man of any wealth had gathered up his people, in that ancient settled world he had raised a wall around them, thick walls of rammed earth and stone that a horse cannot leap and an arrow cannot pierce, with towers and gates and moats of dark water, and behind those walls the townsfolk could sit, and eat their stored grain, and wait, while the horsemen of the steppe circled outside in helpless fury, with no more idea of how to get in than a wolf has of how to open a locked door. And that was the great question, the great puzzle, that stood between Genghis Khan and everything he wanted. He had built the finest field army on the earth. But the treasure of the earth was kept behind walls, and his army did not, yet, know how to take a wall. And so, before he could ever hope to swallow one of the great old empires whole, he had to teach an entire nation of horsemen a thing no horseman had ever needed to know. He had to teach them how to be besiegers. And the place he learned it, the first hard schoolroom of the Mongol siege, was a kingdom you have very likely never heard of, a proud and clever and half-forgotten kingdom tucked in along the great bend of the Yellow River, the kingdom of the Tangut people, that the Chinese called Western Xia. Let me show it to you, gently, because it is worth seeing. Away to the south and west of the Mongolian grass, where the steppe gives way at last to desert and to the long green thread of the Yellow River running through it, there lay a kingdom that was small beside the giants around it, but rich far past its size. The Tangut were a settled people, farmers and traders and devout followers of the Buddha, and their land sat squarely across the great road of the caravans, the road that carried silk and jade and spices and silver between China and the far west, so that the wealth of half the world trickled through their fingers as it passed. They had cities of packed earth with high strong walls. They had their own writing, their own learning, their own emperor in his own walled capital of Zhongxing on the river. They had irrigation canals and granaries and workshops, all the soft heavy machinery of a civilization, and they had, crucially, no idea at all how much danger they were in. And Genghis, looking south from his new-made nation, saw in the Tangut kingdom exactly the thing a careful man wants for his first hard lesson. He saw a prize rich enough to be worth the trouble, and small enough to be survivable if the lesson went badly, and close enough to reach across the desert, and cut off enough from its greater neighbours that no one would come rushing to save it. He saw, in short, a place to practice. And so, in a series of probing raids that grew year by year into a real war, the Mongols came down off the grass and into the settled country, and began, clumsily at first and then with a terrible growing skill, to learn their new and dreadful trade. The early raids were easy, and taught them little, for out in the open fields the Tangut armies could no more stand against Mongol horse than anyone else could, and were ridden down and scattered. But then the horsemen came up against the first of the walled towns, and there they stopped, and there the real learning began. They found that they could not simply gallop at a wall. They found that a city with food and water inside it and stout walls around it could sit and wait, and let the besiegers grow bored and hungry and sick out in the open, and that the whole speed and fury that made the Mongols so terrible in the field counted for nothing at all against a gate that would not open. And they were not proud men in the way that ruins an army. They were, above everything else, practical, and Genghis above all of them, and where they did not know a thing they set themselves to learn it, from anyone who could teach them. They took prisoners who knew the building trades. They studied the walls and how they were made. And in the year that we would count as 1209, they drove at last through the fields and the fallen towns all the way to the great capital itself, to Zhongxing on its river, the strongest place in the whole Tangut land. And there they sat down before its high walls to see whether their new lessons had taught them enough to crack the hardest nut of all. And here the story turns, for a moment almost gentle, almost comic, in the way that the very greatest men are sometimes brought up short by the plain stubbornness of the world, because their first great attempt to take a great city did not work at all, and it failed in a way that must have taught them more than any easy victory ever could. They could not storm the walls, they were too high and too well defended. And so someone among them, thinking hard, looked at the river that ran past the city, the great yellow river swollen with the summer melt, and had an idea that was clever and enormous and just slightly beyond them. They would not climb the walls, they would drown them. They set the whole army to labour like ants, building great dikes and channels to dam the river and turn its weight against the city, to lift the water up and up until it poured over the ramparts and washed the proud capital away. And it very nearly worked. The water rose against the walls and the city choked and suffered behind them through the long months, and the Tangut Emperor in his flooded streets grew desperate. But the Mongols were horsemen playing at being engineers, and the river was older and stronger than their learning, and in the deep of the winter the great earthworks they had raised gave way, and the flood they had built turned in their hands and broke the wrong way, and came roaring down not on the city but on the Mongol camp, so that it was the besiegers, in the end, who were driven back drenched and floundering from the drowned ground. It should have been a humiliation. In lesser hands it would have been a defeat. But Genghis had built the thing on the river he wanted, which was not really a broken dike, but a frightened enemy, and the Tangut Emperor, looking out at the terrible patient horde that had come so close to washing his capital off the earth, and would clearly only come back stronger, decided that submission was wiser than another year of this. He sent out from the gates his surrender and his tribute, camels in their thousands and falcons and rich bolts of woven cloth, and he sent out, in the old hard custom of that world, a daughter of his own house to be a wife to the Mongol Khan, and he bent his knee, and he swore to be a vassal, and to send his soldiers to march wherever the great Khan should call them. And Genghis, who had gotten everything he truly wanted, lifted the siege and rode away north, having lost a battle to a river and won a kingdom, and carrying home in his baggage the one thing worth more than all the camels and the silk together. He carried home the beginnings of the knowledge of how to take a city. Hold that submission in your mind, quietly, as you drift, that promise the Tangut Emperor swore to send his men wherever the Khan should call, because it is a small stitch drop now that will be picked up again. Years and years down the road, right at the very end of the long life we are following, and it will matter more than anyone that day could guess. But the Tangut kingdom, for all its wealth, was only the schoolroom. It was the small hard problem a wise man sets himself before he attempts the great one. And the great one lay just to the east, filling the whole north of what we now call China. An empire so vast and so rich and so long established that the little Tangut land was a village beside it. This was the empire of the Jin, the empire of the Jurchen, and to understand why Genghis turned upon it with such particular and long-nursed hunger, you have to understand that it was not for him only a matter of treasure. It was a matter of blood, and of an old, old debt. For the Jin were the great power that had loomed over the steppe for 100 years, the giant to the south that had kept the grassland tribes weak and quarrelling on purpose, playing one against another, buying this Khan to murder that one, riding out every few years to burn the Mongol camps and drive off their horses and thin their numbers, so that no single steppe people should ever grow strong enough to threaten the rich lands below. And they had done once a particular thing that the Mongols had never forgotten and never forgiven. In the days of Genghis's own forefathers, they had taken captive a great chief of the Mongols, an ancestor of his line, and rather than simply killing him, they had nailed him alive to a wooden frame, a kind of wooden donkey, and left him there to die slowly as a warning to the grass. and the memory of that death had been passed down the generations like a coal kept warm under ash, from father to son, mother to child, waiting Genghis himself in his younger days, when his nation was not yet made, had even bent to the Jinn as their nominal servant, had carried them tribute up to their frontier, had knelt in the old required way, because he was not yet strong enough to do otherwise, and a man remembers such kneelings. So there was an account here that ran back generations, and Genghis meant to settle it in full. The moment came, as these moments so often do, over a small matter of ceremony that laid bare the whole balance of the world. An old Jin emperor died, and a new one came to the throne, a man of no great gifts, and by the long custom between the empire and its steppe vassals an envoy came north to the Mongols to announce the new reign and to receive, on the new emperor's behalf, the tribute and the kneeling submission that a vassal owed. And Genghis, who had by now united all the grass and drowned a kingdom on the Yellow River and knew exactly how strong he had become, received the envoy standing, and asked who the new emperor was, and when he was told the name, he did a thing that rang across the whole of the north like a struck bell. He turned his face to the south, toward the distant throne of the mightiest empire in his world, and he spat upon the ground. An imbecile like that, he said in effect to be the ruler of the Middle Kingdom, appointed by heaven itself? He had thought the Emperor of China was some being out of the sky. And with that, he mounted his horse and rode away north, leaving the envoy standing, and the message could not have been plainer if it had been carved in stone. There would be no more tribute. There would be no more kneeling. The 100 years of Jin mastery over the steppe were over, and the debt was going to be collected. And in the year 1211, the great host came down off the grass, crossed the burning waste of the Gobi that had always sheltered the settled lands from the north, and fell upon the empire of the Jin. Now think, for a moment, in the warm dark, of the sheer size of what he was attacking, because it is the size that makes the whole thing almost impossible to believe. The Jin Empire held tens of millions of people, where the entire Mongol nation, every man and woman and child and grandmother of it, numbered perhaps a single million all told. It held hundreds of walled cities, great and small, and behind those walls it could raise armies that dwarfed anything the steppe could put in the field. Hundreds of thousands of trained soldiers with armour and crossbows and siege engines, and the accumulated craft of 1,000 years of Chinese warfare, and it had, running along its northern edge, lines of walls and fortresses built for the single purpose of keeping people exactly like Genghis out. By every reckoning that a sensible man could make, it was madness. It was a nation of 1 million herders attacking an empire of 50 million behind stone. And it worked, and the reason it worked is one of the quiet lessons of the whole long life we are tracing. And it is this, that the Jin were vast and rich and settled. And a vast, rich, settled thing is slow and comfortable and afraid to lose what it has, while the Mongols owned almost nothing and could go anywhere, and had, every one of them, been forged in a school of hunger and hardship that the soft cities could not imagine. The great empire had grown a shell, and inside the shell it had grown tender. The first great blow fell at a place among the hills called the Badger's Pass, the Wild Fox Ridge, where the main army of the Jin, an enormous host gathered to smash the northern raiders once and for all, met the Mongols in the field, out in the open, on exactly the kind of ground where no one on earth could stand against Genghis's horse. And the Mongols did to that great army what they did to every army foolish enough to meet them in the open. They shattered it. They tore it to pieces and rode it down in the flight and killed until they were weary of killing, and the slaughter was so vast that, we are told, a traveller passing that lonely ridge years and years afterward could still see the ground white for miles, with the bones of the Jin dead, lying where they had fallen and never been gathered. The field army of the north was gone, broken in a single day, and with it went the Empire's best hope of stopping the horde in open battle. But the city still stood, and here, now, was where all the hard learning of the Tangut schoolroom came due, because a broken field army does not win you an empire. An empire lives in its cities, behind its walls, and the Jin had more cities and higher walls than any land Genghis had ever seen, and to take them the horsemen would have to become, on a scale no steppe people had ever dreamed of, masters of the slow-grinding science of the siege. And they did become masters of it, and they did it in the only way a practical people ever learns anything, which is by taking it from those who already knew. For the Empire of the Jinn was not a single loyal people, it was a conquered land ruling over other conquered peoples, and many of those peoples hated their Jurchen masters far more than they feared the Mongols. Whole populations came over. Skilled men, learned men, came out from the cities and knelt to Genghis and offered him their knowledge, and he, who never in his life cared what a useful man's birth or race or religion might be, took them up gladly and set them to work and rewarded them well. And so into the Mongol host there flowed, army by army, the very brains and hands of Chinese siegecraft. Engineers came, men who knew the mathematics of walls and the making of machines, and with them came the machines themselves, or the knowledge to build them fresh from the timber of any forest they passed. They learned to build the great catapults, the beam engines worked by teams of men hauling on ropes that could fling stones the weight of a man to crack a rampart or hurl pots of blazing naphtha and screaming incendiary fire over the walls and into the crowded streets beyond. They learnt to build siege towers and covered rams to batter the gates, and vast ramps of earth and rubble raised patiently up against the walls until the horsemen could simply walk over the top. They learned to fill the moats, driving before them, in the cruelest of their new methods, great herds of captured prisoners forced to carry earth and bundles of brush to choke the ditches under the arrows of their own countrymen, so that the Mongols spent the lives of the conquered to buy the walls of the yet unconquered. And they learned, most of all, the pure patience of the thing, the willingness to sit down before a city and stay there, month after month, while hunger did the work that no catapult could do. It is one of the most astonishing transformations in the whole story of war, and it happened in the space of a few years. A nation that had begun the decade not knowing how to open a locked gate ended it able to take, one after another, the strongest walled cities in the eastern world. They poured across the great flat plain of the north, 3 armies of them fanning out under Genghis and his sons and his hard generals, and they took city after city and town after town, and the country between the walls was harrowed and burned and emptied until the smoke of it hung over the whole land. The Jin court, shut up in its capital, reeled from the shock of it, and that capital, the heart and prize of the whole empire, was one of the greatest cities that then stood anywhere upon the earth, a place called Zhongdu, the central capital, standing where the huge city of Beijing stands to this very day. See it, before it falls, as it was in its glory. It was ringed by walls of packed earth so thick and so tall that they made a mountain range of their own, walls miles upon miles around, studded with hundreds of towers, pierced by great iron-bound gates, guarded by moats and by outlying forts, defended by a garrison of many thousands and stocked with the granaries of an empire. It was thought, quite simply, to be one of the cities that could not be taken. And Genghis took it. He did not take it quickly, and he did not in truth take it by storm, for even his new-schooled engineers could not simply batter down a thing so vast. He took it the way the greatest sieges have always been won, by closing his hand around it and slowly squeezing until it died. His armies had already stripped the whole country round about, so that no food and no rescue could come to the trapped city, and then he settled down to wait, and inside those magnificent walls the slow horror of a starving city played itself out through the long months. The stored grain ran low, and then it ran out. The people ate what they could find, and then they ate what should never be eaten, and the accounts that come down to us from inside those walls are things we will not linger over tonight, for this is a story to fall asleep to and not to be frightened by, and it is enough to say only that hunger in a great sealed city does to human beings things that the open steppe, for all its hardness, never had to do. The garrison weakened, the commanders quarrelled and despaired. The relief that the frightened court had promised never truly came, or came too little and too late and was scattered. And at last, in the year 1215, the great capital of the Jinn, the uncrackable city, opened, and the Mongols came in over the walls that had kept out every enemy for generations, and the sack that followed was one of the terrible ones. A burning and a plundering so vast that it is said the fires of it smouldered for a month, and a traveller who passed that way not long after wrote that the ground near the walls was greasy underfoot with the fat of the dead, and that the bones lay in white hills. Set that down gently, and do not carry it into your sleep. Only understand what it meant. It meant that the thing was proven. It meant that the machine Genghis had built out of the broken tribes of the grass, the machine of the tens and the hundreds and the yam and the yassa, had now been tested against the very richest and oldest and best defended civilization within its reach, and had not merely survived the test, but had cracked that civilization's greatest city like an egg. The empire of the Jinn was not finished. It would fight on for years yet. Its court fled far to the south behind the Yellow River. Its long death left in the capable hands of Genghis's finest general to grind out slowly, while the Khan turned his attention elsewhere. But its back was broken, and everyone in the world who was watching, which was everyone, understood that something had changed in the order of things that would never change back. And now step back with me, all the way back, one more time, as far back as we have ever gone, and let the whole size of it settle over you softly in the dark. Remember the boy. Remember the ragged, starving boy of the very beginning of this story, the outcast child fleeing across the frozen river with a wooden collar locked about his neck, the boy whose own clan had left his mother to feed her children on roots and dead fish and the small mercy of the grass, the boy who had nothing in all the world but an iron will, and would very likely, any sensible person of that day would have said, die young and forgotten and cold. Hold that boy in your mind. And now look at the man he had become. Look at him standing amid the smoke of the fallen capital of one of the greatest empires on the earth. The master now not only of the whole endless steppe, but of the rich walled cities of the settled world, the collector of the debt his ancestors had died owing, the conqueror who had taught horsemen to break down mountains of stone, from the frozen river to the burning city, from the boy who starved on the grass to the man before whom the Middle Kingdom itself had fallen. There is no distance in all of human story quite like that distance, and he had crossed it in a single lifetime, and he was not, even now, anywhere near done. For the thing about a machine like the one he had built, the thing we said at the very start of tonight, is that it cannot be set down and left to stand still. It had been drawn back and loosed against the east, and it had struck home, and it had proven itself past all argument. But a proven weapon does not sleep. Already, even as the fires died in the fallen capital, and the long slow finishing of the Jinn was handed off to other hands, the Khan's mind was moving, restless and patient at once, and his eyes were beginning to lift and to turn, away from the burnt cities of China, away from the east where the work was all but done, toward the great caravan roads that ran off westward into the setting sun, toward the rich unknown empires of Central Asia and Persia that lay out along those roads, toward a mighty and confident realm off in the west that had not yet heard his name and did not yet fear it, and would, before very long, give him a reason it would regret for 1,000 years. But that is the next turn of the road, and it can wait, and so can you. Let it all go now. Let the fallen city and the white bones and the burning fires fade back down into the long ago where they belong, and keep only the one warm, astonishing thing, the boy on the frozen river who became the master of the East, and let your breath run slow, and let the lamp burn low, and rest. The gaze is turning westward, and we will follow it when we are ready, and there is no hurry at all, none in the world. We have all the time there is. And so his gaze, which had been turned east and south for so long, toward the walled cities of China and the rivers of the Tangut, came slowly round now toward the setting sun toward the west, and there it settled, and there we must follow it. Softly and without any hurry at all, because what happened in the west is the darkest and the largest thing in this whole long life, and it is the thing that fixed his name, forever after, in the memory of the world. Settle yourself for it. Let your shoulders come down and let the lamp burn low, because I am going to tell you of a great and terrible war, and I am going to tell it to you gently, the way you tell a hard thing to someone who is falling asleep, holding the shape of it up to the light, without pressing your thumb too hard on any of the sharp places, because there is nothing in it tonight that can reach you, and nothing you need to carry, and it has all been over and quiet for 800 years. To the west of the Mongol lands, past the mountains and the long grass and the cold blue lakes, there lay in those years a great and glittering empire, young and rich and proud, and its name was Khwarezm. It was a Muslim empire, an empire of Persia and Central Asia, and it had grown very fast and very large in a single generation, sweeping up under one crown the whole wide country, from the mountains of Afghanistan across to the deserts of Persia and up to the shores of the Caspian Sea, and it was studded all across its length, with some of the most beautiful and ancient and famous cities in the entire world. These were not tents on the grass. These were cities that had stood for 1,000 years and more, cities of blue-tiled domes and slender towers and running water, of libraries and bathhouses and gardens and covered markets a mile long, cities whose names were spoken with wonder from Spain to China, Bukhara the Noble, Samarkand the Shining, Merv the Great, and a dozen others besides, each one a small universe of learning and trade and craft, home to hundreds of thousands of souls. Hold that picture in your mind for a moment, gently, before anything happens to it. The turquoise domes catching the morning sun, the scholars in the cool of the libraries, the merchants in the shaded bazaars, the water running in the channels. It is a good and a peaceful picture, and I want you to have seen it as it was, whole and lovely, before we go on, because the whole weight of what follows lies in the difference between that picture and the one that came after. And ruling over all of it, over all that ancient splendour, there sat a young and ambitious king, the Shah Muhammad, the second of that name, a proud man, a conqueror in his own right, who had beaten his neighbours and swelled his borders, and believed himself, not without reason, to be the greatest monarch in the world, the champion of Islam, the new Alexander. And here is the thing to understand, softly, about how the war began. Because it did not begin, at first, with any lust for conquest at all. It began with trade. For when Genghis Khan, away in the east, first heard of this great rich empire on his far western flank, his thought was not to destroy it. His thought was to sell to it. The two empires, the Mongol and the Khwarezmian, now shared a long frontier, and beyond that frontier lay all the wealth of Persia, and Genghis, who had learnt by now the value of the caravan roads and the silk and the treasure that flowed along them, sent to the Shah a warm and courteous message, proposing peace and open trade between them, and calling the Shah, in the flowery manner of such letters, something like a son, or a most cherished friend. He wanted the roads open, he wanted the goods to flow. He had wars enough already in the east. And to seal this friendship, and to set the trade running, he gathered together a great caravan and sent it west into Khwarezm as a gesture of good faith. Picture that caravan, because everything turns upon it. It was a large one, some 450 men, all of them merchants and their servants, with a long line of camels, near 500 camels, loaded down with the finest goods the East could send, with silks and furs and jade and silver and bars of precious metal, a walking river of wealth, unarmed, peaceful, come to buy and to sell. And it came at last to the first great city of the Khwarezmian Empire on that frontier, a city called Otrar, standing on the banks of a wide river, and there it stopped, as caravans do, to rest and to trade, and to seek the permission of the governor to go on. And the governor of Otrar was a man named Inalchuk, a kinsman of the Shah himself, a proud and greedy man. And when he looked upon that long line of camels and all that treasure sitting there in his city, defenceless, something turned over in him. Perhaps he truly suspected, or told himself he suspected, that among these merchants were spies, men come to spy out the land for the Mongol Khan, and there may even have been some small grain of truth in it, for merchants and spies have always travelled the same roads. But mostly one feels he simply looked at the treasure and wanted it. And so he did a terrible and a foolish thing. He fell upon the caravan. He had the merchants seized, all of them, and accused them of spying, and then he had them killed, every one, 450 men put to the sword in the streets of Otrar, and he took all their goods and all their camels for himself. Only one man escaped, it is said, one camel driver who slipped away and hid, and made the long journey home to the east, to carry the news to Genghis Khan of what had been done. Now hold this next part gently, because it is the true hinge of the whole war, the exact moment where it might still have turned aside and did not. For even now, even after the massacre at Otrar, Genghis Khan did not at once ride to war. He did the correct thing, the lawful thing, the thing a wronged ruler does. He sent envoys. He sent to the Shah Muhammad 3 ambassadors, one of them a Muslim and 2 of them Mongols. And he sent them not with threats, but with a demand for justice, saying, in effect, you and I are at peace, and this outrage was surely the work of your governor, and not your will. So hand over to me this man Inalchuk, that I may punish him for what he has done, and let the peace between us stand. It was a fair demand. It was the demand of a man who still, even then, wanted trade and not war. And the Shah Muhammad, in his pride, in his fatal contempt for these Eastern barbarians of whom he knew so little, threw it back in the worst way a proud king can. He refused to give up his kinsman. And more than that, far more than that, he laid his hands upon the ambassadors, the persons of ambassadors, which even in that hard age were held sacred and untouchable among all peoples. He had the chief envoy put to death, and the other 2 he had shamed, their beards burned off, singed away in the fire, that deepest of insults to a grown man of the steppe, and he sent them back to Genghis Khan like that, alive and disfigured and burning with humiliation. To carry the answer home, there is a story told of what Genghis Khan did when the envoys came back to him with their scorched faces and their news, and whether it is exactly true or not, it tells you the truth of the thing, so let it stand. It is said that he did not rage and did not shout, but that he went up alone onto a mountain, a high and quiet place. And there he took off his hat and loosened his belt and threw it over his shoulder, and he knelt down on the bare ground under the wide sky, and he prayed for 3 days and 3 nights to the eternal blue heaven, saying that he had not sought this war, that the wrong was not his, and asking the sky for the strength to avenge it. And on the 3rd day he came down off the mountain, and the thing was decided, and there would be no more talk of trade. Understand, softly, what had happened. A door had been opened, and the Shah in his pride had slammed it shut and barred it, and behind that closed door there was now nothing left but the whole gathered fury of the Mongol nation, and it was about to come down upon his beautiful cities like the end of the world. He had, without in the least understanding what he was doing, murdered the merchants, and burned the beards, and killed the envoy of the most dangerous man who had ever lived, and now that man was coming. And so, in the year 1219, the great host went west. It was an army such as had rarely been seen, well over 100,000 horsemen, some say many more, and with it went all the machinery he had learnt in China, the engineers and the catapults and the siegecraft. The whole finished war machine we watched him build turned now toward Persia. And the Shah Muhammad, who commanded on paper an even larger army than the Khans, made in the very first days the single worst decision of the whole war, the decision that doomed him. He did not gather his great host together and meet the Mongols in one place, in the open field, where numbers might have told. He was afraid, you see, afraid of his own generals, afraid that if he gathered a great army in one man's hand that man might turn it against him. For such was the treacherous world he ruled, and so instead he scattered his soldiers, spreading them out among his many cities, a garrison here and a garrison there, each strong city to defend itself behind its own walls. And by doing so he handed Genghis Khan exactly the war the Mongols knew best how to fight, a war of one city at a time, each one surrounded and cut off and swallowed alone. With no great field army ever coming to its rescue, because there was no great field army, only 100 separate garrisons waiting behind 100 separate walls for their turn to be devoured. And devoured they were, one after another, in a campaign so swift and so overwhelming that the people who lived through it could scarcely believe it was happening. Otrar itself, where it had all begun, was the first, and it was surrounded and besieged, and it held out for a long time, for months, but in the end its walls were broken and the city was taken, and the governor Inalchuk, the greedy man who had started the whole catastrophe by falling upon the caravan, was taken alive and brought before his conquerors. And there is a legend of how he died, and I will give it to you only as a legend, because such stories grow in the telling. But they say that because his greed had been for silver and gold, they killed him by pouring molten silver into his eyes and his ears, so that the metal he had murdered for should be the death of him at the last. Whether it is true or only a story, it carries the mood of that war, the sense of a wronged and pitiless justice come at last, and the governor of Otrar passes here out of the tale. Now Genghis Khan did a thing that the Shah and all his men never expected, a thing that has been marvelled at ever since. He split his own army into several parts and sent them by different roads, so that the Khwarezmians never knew where the blow would fall next, and he himself, with one great column, did the impossible. Between him and the rich cities of the empire's heart there lay a desert, the red waterless waste of the Kizilkum, a sea of sand that everyone knew no army could cross, and for that very reason it was left unguarded, undefended, the safe flank that needed no watching. And Genghis Khan, guided it is said by captured local men who knew the hidden wells, took his horsemen straight into it and vanished, and marched for days through the empty burning sand, and came out the other side exactly where no one on earth thought an army could ever be. Deep behind the frontier, in the soft undefended belly of the empire, before the walls of the noble and ancient city of Bukhara. Think of the terror of that, gently, to be a citizen of Bukhara, safe behind your walls with the whole army of the empire between you and the enemy, and to wake one morning and see, out on the plain where no army could possibly be, the dust of 100,000 Mongol horses. It was as though they had risen up out of the ground. Bukhara fell quickly, early in the year 1220. The garrison tried to break out and was cut down, and the city opened its gates, and Genghis Khan rode in. And here there is a scene, one of the most famous in his whole story, and I will tell it to you quietly. He rode his horse, they say, into the very heart of the city, into the great Friday Mosque, the largest and most sacred building in Bukhara, mistaking its grandeur at first perhaps for the palace of the Shah. And he stood there in that holy place, this illiterate lord of the grasslands amid the finest learning of Islam. And the frightened people were gathered before him, and he spoke to them, through an interpreter, words that have echoed down the centuries. He told them, so the story goes, that they must have committed great sins, great and terrible sins, for God to have sent such a punishment as him down upon them. I am, he is remembered to have said, the punishment of God. If you had not sinned, God would not have sent me. There is a chill in those words, and there is also, if you listen, something stranger and quieter, a kind of dreadful humility. A man who saw himself not as the author of the storm, but only as its instrument, the flail in the hand of the sky. And then the city was given over to be plundered, and much of it, being built of wood and clay, caught fire and burned, and beautiful Bukhara, the noble, the ornament of the East, was for the most part reduced to ash and empty ground, and the scholars scattered, and the libraries burned, and the survivors driven out. Let it grow quiet in your mind. We are only passing through. From Bukhara he turned to the greatest prize of all, to Samarkand, the shining capital, the richest and best defended of all the cities of the empire, with a mighty garrison inside it, tens of thousands of soldiers, and even a troop of war elephants, and walls that the Shah had believed could never fall. And Samarkand fell in a matter of days, The garrison came out to fight and was drawn into the Mongols' favourite trap, the false retreat, and surrounded and destroyed. The elephants, panicked, did more harm to their own side than to the enemy, and the heart went out of the city's defenders, and Samarkand too opened its gates and was taken and plundered, its people counted and sorted. The craftsmen and the artisans and the skilled spared and sent east to serve the Khan, the rest scattered or worse. In a single season, the two greatest cities of one of the greatest empires on earth had simply ceased to be what they were. And still there was no great army in the field to stop it, only the Shah Muhammad, running for the Shah, you see, once he understood what had come upon him. Once he saw his cities falling like wheat before the scythe, and grasped at last the size of the thing he had provoked, lost his nerve entirely, and he did the one thing a king must never do. He ran. He abandoned his empire, abandoned his cities and his people to their fate, and fled westward with a small band of followers, hoping only to save himself. And Genghis Khan, hearing of it, detached 2 of his finest generals to hunt him down. Keep these 2 names gently, for they are about to do one of the most astonishing things in all the history of war. One was Hyebe, the archer, the man who had once, as an enemy, shot Genghis Khan's own horse from under him, and had confessed it freely when captured, and been forgiven and raised up for his boldness. And the other was Subutai, the blacksmith's son, the greatest soldier the Mongols ever produced, a man who would in his long life conquer more of the earth than any general who has ever lived. These 2, with a force of perhaps 20 or 30,000 horsemen, were let off the leash to chase the Shah. And they chased him, and here begins the great ride. They pursued him across the whole width of Persia, and he fled before them, from city to city, never resting, never able to gather a new army, because they were always at his heels, driving him on, exhausted, ragged, a great king reduced to a hunted animal. They chased him for months, over the mountains and across the plains, and one by one his hopes fell away, and his followers dwindled, until at the very last, sick and broken, and with almost nothing left, the Shah Muhammad, who had ruled the richest empire on earth and called himself the second Alexander, came to the shore of the Caspian Sea and took a small boat out to a little lonely island lying just off the coast, a bare and comfortless place, to hide from the horsemen who could not follow him over the water. And there, on that small island, in the winter of the year 1220, alone and destitute, without his crown, without his kingdom, without hardly a servant to close his eyes, he sickened and he died, of a disease of the lungs and one imagines of despair, and they buried him in a spare shirt because there was nothing better to be had. Hold that quietly beside the golden pride of the man who had burned the envoys' beards. It is a hard, sad, human ending, and it is worth resting on for just a moment, the smallness of that lonely death set against the greatness he had imagined for himself, before we let him go. But the war was not over, for the Shah had a son, a brave and desperate young prince named Jalal al-Din, who would not run, who gathered what fighters he could, and fought the Mongols hard for a while longer in the mountains of the south, and won even a battle or 2, and led Genghis Khan a long and bitter chase down toward the river Indus before he was at last broken and forced to leap his horse from a high bank into the river and swim to safety, escaping into India, a feat so brave that Genghis, watching from the bank, is said to have told his own sons to look and learn what a man was. And meanwhile, while the young prince was hunted in the south, the last great cities of the empire were being reduced. And here we come to the darkest passages of the whole story, and I am going to hold them up to you only briefly, only long enough that you know the truth of the scale, and then we will move on and leave them, because there is no good in dwelling on the deepest dark, and no need. 2 cities above all carry the weight of it. One was Merv, the Great, one of the largest and most learned cities in the entire world, a city of libraries and gardens, and it surrendered and was destroyed almost utterly. And the other was Nishapur, and Nishapur is remembered with a special horror. because during its siege a beloved son-in-law of Genghis Khan, a man married to one of his own daughters, was struck and killed by an arrow shot from the walls, and when the city fell, the grief and rage of that loss came down upon it, and the vengeance taken there was total. These were among the greatest cities of their age, and they were unmade, their people slain in numbers the mind cannot truly hold, their walls thrown down, their canals broken, the very fields around them ruined. Now you will hear enormous numbers for these things, hundreds of thousands, more. And the honest truth is that we cannot really know how many, that the chroniclers of that time counted in a poetry of horror rather than in ledgers, and that the numbers are surely swollen in the telling. But strip away every exaggeration, halve it and halve it again, and what is left is still one of the most terrible things human beings have ever done to one another. Whole cities and whole regions emptied, a garden civilization 1,000 years in the making broken in the space of a few short years, some of those ruined places, they say, never truly recovering to this day. Let that be enough. I will not paint it for you in the dark. Let the smoke drift off, and the ground grow quiet and green again in your mind, as in truth, slowly, over centuries, it did. We are moving on, because now I must tell you the strangest and grandest thing of all, the Great Ride, and this at least is a wonder rather than a horror. So let us lift our eyes to it. Those two generals, Jebbe and Subutai, having chased the Shah to his lonely death on the island, sent word to Genghis Khan asking leave, before they turned home, to keep going, to make a great sweep around and see what lay beyond the far edge of the known world, and he gave them leave, and what they did next has never quite been equalled. With their 20,000 horsemen, that single detachment, they rode on west and north, right around the bottom and up the far side of the Caspian Sea, through country no Eastern army had ever seen. They crossed the high wall of the Caucasus Mountains in the dead of winter, through passes said to be impassable, losing men and horses to the cold. They came down into the land of Georgia and shattered the flower of its Christian knighthood in a single afternoon. They passed on north into the wide grasslands above the Black Sea, the country of the Kipchak and the Cuman nomads, and beat them too, and drove them fleeing westward. And there, on the steppe, they met for the first time the armies of the Russian princes, of the scattered principalities of the Rus, who had come out with their Kipchak allies to face this strange new terror out of the east, and at a river called the Kalka, in the year 1223, Subutai destroyed them, one of the great victories of his life, breaking a Russian and Kipchak host far larger than his own through patience and trickery and the long-feigned retreat. And then, having ridden clear around the Caspian Sea, having beaten Georgians and Kipchaks and Russians and half a dozen peoples besides, having covered thousands upon thousands of miles through utterly unknown lands and lost, in the end, hardly a battle, these two generals simply turned their horses and rode home again, all the way back across the top of Asia to rejoin the Khan, carrying in their heads the first knowledge the Mongols ever had of Russia and the lands of Europe beyond it, knowledge that their grandsons would one day put to terrible use. It is one of the most extraordinary feats of arms in the whole history of the world, a reconnaissance in force that circled an entire inland sea, and it was to Genghis Khan almost a detail, a thing done by a couple of his officers on their way home from the main event. And now, having held all that thunder and fire up to the light, I want to set beside it something very much quieter, something soft and strange and, in its way, more revealing of the man than any siege, because it happened in the very same years, in the very heart of that Western war, and it shows you a side of him that the burning cities never can. For in the midst of all this conquering, this old man, and he was old now, past 60, grey, feeling the years in his bones and the nearness of the end, this master of half the world, turned his mind to a question that no army could answer for him. He wanted to know how to live longer. He wanted to know whether there was, somewhere in the wisdom of the settled peoples he had conquered, a secret, a medicine, an art that could hold off death and stretch out his days. And he had heard, away in the east, of a holy man, a Taoist sage from the mountains of China. An old master named Changchun, who was said by the people to be 100 and more years old, and to possess the secrets of long life, perhaps even the elixir of immortality itself. And so Genghis Khan, in the middle of his Great Western War, sent a courteous and pressing summons all the way back east to this old hermit, inviting him, begging him almost, to come to him. And picture this now, gently, for it is a lovely and unlikely thing. This old Taoist master, Changchun, who was in truth about 70, no immortal but only a wise and honest old man, set out from the mountains of China with a handful of disciples, one of whom carefully wrote down everything they saw, and he travelled, on foot and by cart, for the better part of 2 years, across the whole enormous width of Asia, over the deserts and the mountains and the grasslands, following the track of the armies, all the way to the Khan's camp in the mountains south of Samarkand, near the roof of the world. An old scholar in his robes, jolting across the same deserts the horseman had crossed, come to answer a conqueror's question. And when at last he was brought before Genghis Khan, the Khan received him with great honour and warmth, and called him not by his name but simply, respectfully, Holy Immortal, and then he asked him the question that had drawn him 10,000 miles. "Tell me," he said in effect, "you who are said to be so very old and so very wise, what medicine of long life have you brought me? What is the secret? How may I live forever?" And here is the thing that makes the old man great, and makes the moment worth all the miles. Changchun did not flatter him, he did not spin him a tale, or promise him a magic draught, or claim powers he did not have, though it would have been the safe and easy thing to do before the most dangerous man alive. He told him the plain truth. There is no medicine of immortality, he said. There is no elixir, no secret draught that can make a man live forever. I have no such thing, and no one has. There are only ways to guard the life you have, to make it longer and better, and those ways are simple, and they are these: to live with restraint, to quiet the desires, to still the passions, to be moderate in all things, to sleep alone and eat plainly, and not exhaust the body in the hunt or the flesh, to still the noise of the heart and let the spirit rest. That, he said, and not some potion, is the only true art of long life. Long life comes from calm, and from cleanliness of living, and from letting go. And Genghis Khan, this man of endless appetite and endless war, listened to the old sage tell him, honestly, that the road to a long life ran through moderation and stillness, and he was not angered by it, he was moved by it. He honoured the old man for his honesty, and had his words written down, and kept him near for a time to talk with him, this strange soft counterpoint to the whole roaring engine of his life, the conqueror of the world sitting quietly in a tent at the edge of the mountains, asking an old hermit how a man ought to live, and being told, gently, to want less. When Changchun at last took his leave to make the long journey home, the Khan sent him away with honour and gave protection and freedom from taxes to all his order, and the two of them never met again, but the meeting stayed with the old Khan, one feels, in the years that were left to him. And that tonight is where we will let it rest, with the two pictures held side by side in the quiet dark, the way this whole life seems always to come in twos. On the one hand, the fire and the fallen cities, Bukhara burning and Samarkand taken, and the Shah dead on his lonely island, and the great ride sweeping clear around the Caspian Sea. And on the other hand, the same old man in the same years, sitting still in a tent, asking an honest hermit about the ordering of the world and the lengthening of a life, and being told to be calm, and to want less, and to let go. For by now you must understand softly the sheer size of what this outcast boy had become. The starving child in the wooden collar, the orphan on the empty grass, was master now of a world that stretched from the Pacific Ocean in the east, where his armies stood on the shores of the sea beyond China, all the way to the edge of Europe in the west, where his generals had ridden past the Caspian and the Black Sea and touched the rim of Russia. the largest reach of power that any single man had ever gathered into one hand upon the earth, and never before or since has one life spanned so much of the world. And he knew it, and he was old, and the old hermit's honest words were sitting somewhere in him, and it was time, at last, after all these years and all these wars, to turn the horses around and go home, east. Back across the whole width of the world he had conquered, toward the grasslands where it had all begun. But that long road home, and what waited for him at the end of it, is for another night. For now there is nothing at all to hold. Let the cities be rebuilt in your mind, and the grass grow back, and the old Khan and the old sage sit talking quietly in their tent under the mountains, and let yourself sink down into the warm and the dark, because the story is nearly home now, and so very gently are you. And so the great Khan turned. At last, for home. Think of the size of that turning, gently, the way you would turn a slow, heavy wheel in the dark. He had gone out from the grasslands of Mongolia a lifetime before as a raider among raiders, and now he came back across the whole width of Asia as the master of more of the earth than any man had ever held, and the journey home alone was a thing to marvel at. Month upon month of riding, the great ordeal, the moving court of tents and carts and horse herds and captured craftsmen and gathered treasure, flowing slowly eastward out of Persia and Central Asia, up over the passes, down across the deserts, back toward the cold, clean rivers of the country where he had been born. He was an old man now, by the reckoning of the steppe, somewhere past 60, his body worn hard by more than half a century of war and weather and old wounds, and there is no hurry at all tonight to hurry him along that road, because we are coming, softly and without any grief, to the end of his long life, and the end of ours together, and there is time, all the time there could be, to walk the last of it slowly. Let your breath go long, let the day behind you fall away. The story is nearly done, and it will set itself down as gently as a lamp being carried out of a room, and you may drift off whenever you like, because I will carry the great Khan home whether you follow every step or not. He came back to a world he had made, and that is a strange thing to come home to. The steppe he had left as a boy had been a chaos of feuding clans, a place where no man's cattle and no man's children were safe from the next valley over, and he had, in the years of his rising, gathered all of that scattered warring people into one hand, one nation, one law, and now that nation stretched away in every direction farther than a rider could go in a season. He was not a young man returning to prove himself. He was an old one returning to rest, if such a man could ever truly rest, among the felt tents and the horse milk and the long grass and the enormous sky of the only home he had ever really wanted. And yet even now, even here at the very end, with the whole world behind him and nothing left to prove, there was one small unfinished thing gnawing at the edge of that iron patience, one old debt still owed and not yet collected, and it lay close to home, just to the south, in the kingdom of the people called the Tangut, the walled and settled realm known as the Western Shia. You may remember them, softly, from long ago in this story, for they were among the very first of the settled peoples his horsemen had ever learnt to fight, back before he had turned his gaze west, back when he was still learning how a man of the grass takes a city of stone. He had beaten them in those early days, and he had made their king bend the knee and pay tribute and swear to be his vassal, and for a time that had been enough. But then, when the great war against the rich empire of Khwarezm was coming, when he had summoned every people under his sway to send their fighting men to ride with him into the west, the Tangut king had refused the summons of Genghis Khan. And worse than the refusal was the manner of it, for one of the Tangut ministers, a proud man secure behind his walls, had sent back an answer sharp enough to cut. Something to the effect that if the great Khan had not strength enough to win his wars without borrowing other men's soldiers, then he had no business calling himself the ruler of the world at all. Hold that insult in your mind for just a moment, gently, and then let it go, because it did not go from him. He carried it. All through the long years of the Western War, through the falls of Bukhara and Samarkand and Merv, through the whole cataclysm we walked through last time, that small hard stone of an insult sat in him, waiting, and he had said, in the way that he said such things, quietly and without heat, and entirely meaning it, that when he came home he would settle it. And now he was home. So in the autumn of the year 1226, an old man who might have laid down his arms and lived out his days among the herds instead, mustered his people one last time and rode south against the Tangut, to keep a promise made in anger years before. And here, on this final campaign, the thing that had never yet happened to him began at last to happen. His body began to fail. It came as these things so often come, not in battle, but in a small and ordinary moment, on a winter's hunt, which was the great pleasure of his life, and the thing he had done since he was a starving boy chasing marmots across the grass. They were riding down wild horses, a great sweeping chase across the frozen country, when the horses turned, as wild horses will, and came surging back toward the riders, and the Khan's own mount, startled, shied and threw him, and the old man went down hard onto the frozen ground. He was helped up. He made light of it, the way old hard men do. But that night the fever came, and it did not fully leave him, and those closest to him understood, with the cold, clear understanding that comes at such times, that something in the great Khan had broken that would not now mend. His counsellors gathered around him in the lamplit dark of the imperial tent, and they urged him, carefully, gently, to turn back, to go home and let his body heal and come again against the Tangut another year when he was strong. And he would not. There is something in that refusal that tells you the whole of him, so let it settle slowly. He knew better than any of them what the fever meant. He knew he was dying, and precisely because he was dying, he would not turn away from the last thing he had set himself to do, because to a people who had watched him never once fail to keep a word, to turn back now, weak and sick, would be to unsay his whole life. If the Tangut saw the great Khan falter, if they saw him limp home to die, the fear that held his whole vast empire together, the certainty that his word was iron and his reach was without limit, might begin to loosen. So he stayed, sick and feverish, an old man on the edge of his own death. He stayed in the field and pressed the war against the walled cities of the Tangut, and his armies, as they always had, ground forward, taking the towns one after another, closing at last upon the great capital itself, the city on the Yellow River, and settling in around its walls for the siege that both sides knew could end only one way. And through that last spring and into that last summer, the failing of the great Khan's body went on, quietly, behind the felt walls of his tent, out of sight of the army and utterly out of sight of the enemy, because it was understood by everyone near him that this, of all things, must be kept secret. Picture it, softly, the way the end of a long life is so often nothing like the roar of the battles that filled it. Not a fall in the thick of the fighting, not a spear or an arrow, but an old man growing weaker on a bed of furs while the ordinary business of a siege went on around him, the councils, the couriers, the slow tightening of the ring around the doomed city, and at the centre of it all the source of everything, the man who had made all of this out of nothing, guttering down like a lamp that has burned all night and is coming, at last, to the bottom of its oil. He gave his final instructions in those days, to the sons and the generals gathered close, about the Tangut, about the empire, about what was to be done, and we will come to those instructions gently in a moment. And then, in the late summer of the year 1227, in the heat of August, with the Tangut capital on the very point of falling, Genghis Khan died. He was, by the likeliest reckoning, about 65 years old, and he had come in that single life from a neck-hang on the frozen steppe to the throne of the world. And here the story does something that almost no other story of so great a man ever does. It closes over him and keeps its silence, and it has kept that silence for nearly 800 years, and it keeps it still. For his death was hidden. His last command, they say, was that his passing be kept secret until the Tangut city had fallen, so that the enemy could not take heart from it. And his people obeyed him in death as completely as they had in life. The siege went on as though nothing had changed. The city surrendered, and the terms were accepted, and only then, with the last of that proud kingdom brought low, was the death of the great Khan allowed to become known, and the vengeance he had promised was carried out to the letter upon the fallen Tangut, so completely that their whole civilization, their kings and their cities and their strange lost language, was very nearly wiped from the earth, a last dark act ordered by a man already dead. And because his death was hidden, because there was no great public dying, no witnessed end, the truth of exactly how he died slipped down into the dark and was lost. And into that darkness the legends came crowding, the way they always do. Some said it was the fall from the horse and the fever that followed, and that is very likely the plain truth of it, and I lean toward it myself, softly, because the plainest thing is so often the true one. But others, in the centuries after, could not believe that so vast a life could end so ordinarily. And they told other tales. Some said he was struck by an arrow in the fighting against the Tangut, and lingered and died of the wound. Some told a stranger, darker story, that among the captives taken from the Tangut king was a princess of great beauty, brought to the Khan's tent, and that she, out of hatred for what had been done to her people, took a terrible secret revenge upon him in the night, and then threw herself into the Yellow River, and that this was the true cause of his death, hushed up out of shame. Others still said it was simply illness, a sickness of the belly, the ordinary failing of an old and worn-out body. We do not know. We will never know, and there is a kind of peace in that, if you let there be, in the fact that the most watched and feared man of his whole age was allowed, at the very last, to slip away into a privacy so complete that not even history was permitted to follow him in. Let it rest. Let him have that. It is not a thing you need to solve tonight, or ever. And then there is the deeper mystery still, the one that men have hunted and dug for and dreamed over ever since, the mystery of where they laid him. For if his death was hidden, his grave was hidden more completely yet, hidden with a thoroughness that has never once been broken. They carried his body home, back north into the country of his birth, and the funeral escort, so the old stories tell, killed every living soul they met upon the road, every traveller, every herdsman, every stranger who chanced to see the great Khan's cortege go by, so that no one outside the innermost circle should ever be able to say which way they had gone or where they had stopped. And somewhere in the homeland, somewhere near the sacred mountain that had sheltered him as a hunted boy, the mountain he had climbed in his youth to pray when the enemy was hunting him, the mountain he had sworn to honour every morning of his life for saving him, they buried him in secret, with his weapons and his treasures and, the tales say, with horses and servants to follow him into the dark. And then they hid the place. They rode 1,000 horses back and forth across the ground until it was beaten flat and indistinguishable from all the grass around it, and the forest grew and the seasons turned, and the men who had dug the grave died with their secret, and the place where the conqueror of the world lies down has never, from that day to this, been found. Somewhere under the grass and the trees of northern Mongolia, in ground his own people have kept sacred and closed for centuries, he is still there, unmarked, unfound, at rest in the one country he ever truly loved. And there is something so fitting in that, so quiet and so right, that I would ask you to let it be the last picture you hold of the man himself, before we widen out to what he left behind, the great Khan lying somewhere under the grass of home, the horses long gone, the forest grown up green and silent over the outcast boy who conquered the world, no stone, no name, only the wind moving in the trees and the enormous sky he was born under, keeping it secret and keeping him. But a man does not build a world and then let it die with him. Or he has built nothing at all, and this the great Khan understood as clearly as he understood everything. So before we let him sleep, we must see the last and perhaps the wisest thing he ever did, which was to arrange, carefully and in good time, for the world to go on without him. There is an old story told of him and his sons that catches it perfectly, so let me tell it to you softly. Feeling his end coming, or perhaps years before, he is said to have gathered his 4 grown sons and given each of them a single arrow and told him to break it, and each of them snapped his single arrow easily, without effort, and then he took a whole bundle of arrows, bound tightly together, and passed the bundle from son to son, and bade each of them break it, and not one of them, however strong, could snap the bound bundle across his knee. Alone, he told them, you are each of you a single arrow, and any enemy may break you. Bound together, you cannot be broken by anyone on earth. Stay bound together. It is not a subtle lesson, and he did not mean it to be, because the thing he feared, the one thing that could undo everything he had made, was not any outside enemy at all. It was his own sons falling upon one another, the way the sons of great conquerors so nearly always do, tearing the empire into pieces in their hunger for the throne, the way Alexander's generals had once torn Alexander's world apart. He had seen his own family destroyed by that kind of jealousy when he was a boy. He was determined it would not destroy the family he had raised so high. So he did the hard, wise, unselfish thing. He named his heir, plainly, before he died, so that there could be no war over it, and the one he named was not the eldest. His eldest son, Jochi, carried under his very name a shadow that had never quite lifted, for Jochi had been born just after his mother Borte was rescued from her captivity among the Merkit, so that all his life there had been a cruel unspoken question of whose son he truly was, and his brothers had used that question against him like a knife, and Jochi, proud and wounded, had drawn away to his own vast lands in the far west, and had died, in fact, a little before his father, so that the eldest line was set aside. The second son, Chagatai, was a hard, harsh, unbending man, a keeper of the law so strict and so severe that even his own father judged him too rigid, too likely to rule by fear alone. And the youngest, Tolui, was the finest soldier of them all, brave and gifted, but young, and by the old custom of the steppe the youngest son was the keeper of the hearth, the one who stayed home and guarded the homeland and the herds, not the one who ruled the world. And so the great Khan's choice fell upon his third son, Ogedei, and it was a choice made not out of favouritism, but out of a clear old eye for what holds a fragile thing together. For Ogedei was the generous one, the open-handed one, the son whom all the others could bear to be ruled by, easy-going where Chagatai was harsh, steady where Jochi had been proud and bitter, a man fond of drink and of giving things away and of keeping the peace, and precisely because he threatened no one and was loved by all, he was the one who could hold the brothers bound together in the bundle. It was the choice of a father who cared more for the survival of what he had built than for any rule of blood or birth, and it was, as it turned out, exactly right. And alongside the naming of the heir came the great division, the parcelling out of the world among his sons, and this too he arranged himself, so that each should have his own vast realm, his own Ulus, and none should have cause to covet his brothers. To the line of his eldest son Jochi went the farthest west, the endless grasslands beyond the great rivers, the lands that would in time become the mighty Khanate of the west, that history remembers as the Golden Horde. To his second son, Chagatai, went the heart of Central Asia, the old rich lands of Khwarezm that had been so terribly conquered, the country of Samarkand and Bukhara, which would carry Chagatai's own name for generations. To Ogedei, along with the supreme title of Great Khan over all the rest, went the lands of the centre and the east. And to the youngest, Tolui, keeper of the hearth, went the Mongol homeland itself, the sacred original ground of the nation, the heartland where his father lay buried. 4 sons, 4 realms, one supreme Khan above them all to keep them bound, and over it all the memory of the arrows, the single arrow that snaps, and the bundle that cannot be broken. It was as careful and as clear-eyed a passing of power as any conqueror in all of history ever managed, and it worked. For when the great Khan was gone, and the period of mourning had passed. The princes and the generals of the whole vast empire came together in the year 1229 in the great assembly of the Mongols, the Kurultai, exactly as their father had bidden them, and they raised Ogedei up upon the veldt and proclaimed him great Khan in his father's place, freely, without a war, without a single brother's hand raised against another. Think of how rare that is, how astonishingly rare, in the whole long bloody chronicle of empires. The conqueror had died at the very height of his power, in the field far from home, with 4 grown ambitious sons and a world's worth of plunder to fight over. And there had been no civil war, no murdered heirs, no tearing apart. The bundle had held, and that, more than any single battle he ever won, may be the truest measure of the man, that he built a thing strong enough and bound it tight enough that it did not fall down when its maker was taken out of it. And now comes the fact that is, when you really let it settle in the quiet of the night, perhaps the most astonishing fact in this whole astonishing story, and I want to lay it down slowly so that its full strangeness can reach you. You might expect that an empire built so entirely upon the will and the genius of one man would begin to shrink the moment that man was gone, would soften and crack and fall inward, the way Alexander's empire had died almost the instant Alexander died. The Mongol Empire did the opposite. After the death of Genghis Khan, it grew. It grew larger and larger and larger still, for another 2 full generations, until it was more than twice the size it had been on the day he died, until it became, and remains to this day, nearly 8 centuries later, the largest continuous land empire that has ever existed upon the face of the earth. Under his son Ogedei, the armies rode out again and finished the conquest of northern China, extinguishing at last the old Jin dynasty that Genghis had first struck. And then, in one of the most breathtaking rides in all of history, the great General Subutai, the finest soldier the Khan had ever raised up, the man who had circled the Caspian Sea in the old days, led the Mongol horsemen west, far past anything Genghis himself had ever seen, across the frozen rivers of Russia in the dead of winter, sacking the cities of the Rus one by one, and then on, over the mountains, into the very heart of Europe, into Poland and Hungary, shattering the massed armies of the Western Knights on field after field, until the Mongol scouts were watering their horses within a few days' ride of Vienna, and the kings of Europe were on their knees praying for deliverance. And deliverance came, though not by any sword, for word arrived from the far side of the world that the great Khan Ogedei had died, and the princes turned their horses around and rode all the way back across a continent to choose his successor, and Europe, which never knew how near it had come, was spared, and still it was not finished. In the generation after that, another grandson of Genghis Khan swept down into the Middle East and took the ancient city of Baghdad, the jewel of the whole Islamic world, and yet another grandson, the famous Kublai Khan, completed the conquest of all of China and sat at last upon the throne of an emperor in a splendour his grandfather could scarcely have imagined, ruling from the Pacific coast of China all the way back across the roof of the world. From the Sea of Japan to the plains of Hungary, from the forests of Siberia to the warm gulfs of Persia. It was all, for one extraordinary moment in the history of the world, a single realm, crossed by a single network of roads and horse stations, held under a single law, all of it flowing outward from the will of one boy who had once been left to starve on the open grass. And that gently is where we have come to at last, at the very end, and it is where I want to bring you all the way back around, back past the conquered cities and the burning empires and the 4 sons and the secret grave, all the way back to the very first thing we ever saw of him, on the very first night of this long story. Do you remember him there? A ragged, half-starved boy in a wooden collar, a fugitive slave stumbling across the frozen steppe in the grey light, with no clan and no cattle and no friend in all the wide world. A boy whose father had been poisoned, whose own people had cast his mother and her children out onto the grass to die. A boy who had nothing at all but the will to live one more day. Hold those 2 pictures together now, softly, in the last of the quiet, the way you might hold a candle flame up beside the dawn. The starving outcast boy in the neck kang on the frozen river. And the master of the greatest empire the earth has ever known, sleeping now under the grass of home, while his sons rule from sea to sea. It is the same person. It is the same one life, running from the one to the other, and there is no story quite like it anywhere else in all the long chronicle of the human race, no fall so low and no rise so high joined in a single span of years. That is the puzzle we set out with, all those nights ago. And the truth is that it has no tidy answer, only the astonishment of the thing itself that it happened at all, that a 9-year-old orphan left to die on the steppe should have ended as the hinge on which the whole history of the world turned. And how in the end should the world remember such a man? Softly, and without any need to decide it tonight, let us simply lay the pieces side by side, the way you would lay out stones on the grass. He was, beyond any argument, one of the great destroyers in all of human history. Whole cities that had stood for 1,000 years he wiped from the earth in an afternoon. Rich and ancient civilizations were unmade at his word, their people slaughtered in numbers so vast that some of the lands his armies crossed did not recover their people or their fields for centuries. And there is no softening that, and we will not try to. And yet he was also, and just as truly, one of the great builders and lawgivers and unifiers the world has ever seen. He took the poorest and most divided people on the earth and forged them into a single nation with a single law. The first written law and the first written script that people had ever known. He built roads and relay stations that carried word and traveller safely across a distance no traveller had ever been able to cross before, so that for 100 years a merchant or a monk could journey the whole width of Asia in a peace and a safety the world had never known and would not know again for a very long time. He decreed that every faith should be free, that no man should be troubled for the God he prayed to, in an age when almost nowhere else on earth was such a thing even imagined. He raised men up by their loyalty and their ability rather than their birth, and in doing so he opened up the world. And through those safe roads flowed not only silk and silver, but ideas and inventions and knowledge, east to west and west to east, so that the whole planet, in a strange hard way, was knit closer together by the very empire that had been so terrible in its making. Builder and destroyer, both at once, in the same hand, and the world has never been able to make him only one or the other, and perhaps that is the honest truth of him, and of a great deal of human greatness besides. And he was one thing more, one last thing, the gentlest of all his titles, and it is the one his own people have kept longest and most tenderly. He was a father, the father of a nation that still bears the shape he gave it, still remembers him not as a monster, but as the man who made them a people, whose face looks out from their money, and whose name is spoken with something close to love in the country of the great grass sky. And he was a father in a stranger and larger way still, for so many of his blood spread out across the conquered world, so many sons and grandsons ruling so many lands and fathering so many children of their own, that today, 800 years on, an almost unimaginable multitude of the people now living upon the earth, many millions upon millions of them scattered from the Pacific to the plains of Europe, carry down through the long chain of the generations the living trace of that one man, the poor boy from the steppe, so that in the most literal way imaginable he is the ancestor of a fair portion of the whole human family. The outcast who had no clan became, in the end, kin to the world. And so we come to the place where the lamp burns lowest, and it is time to let him go, and to let you go too, down into your own good rest. There is nothing more you need to hold. The whole long life is behind us now, all of it, the frozen boy, and the friendless young man, and the gathering of the people, and the wars of the steppe, and the great assembly on the river, and the founding of the nation, and the fall of the cities of China, and the terrible storm in the west, and the quiet death in the field, and the secret grave under the grass, and the empire that grew and grew after he was gone. You have walked the whole of it, from the first breath to the last, And now you may set it all down, every piece of it, the way you set down a heavy pack at the end of a long day's road. Let the great Khan sleep under the grass of his homeland, unfound and at peace, the wind moving in the trees above him. Let the 4 sons rule their 4 quarters of the world in the peace their father brought them. And let yourself sink down now, warm and safe and unburdened, into the soft dark that is waiting for you, wherever you are, however your day has been, knowing that the story is finished and complete, and needs nothing more from you, that the outcast boy came in from the frozen steppe and made himself the ruler of the world and lay down at last in the country he loved, and that you, tonight, may simply close your eyes and rest. Sleep now. It is all told. There is nothing left to do but sleep, and the long grass of the steppe will keep its secret, and the great sky will keep its watch, and so, gently, we come to the end. Good night.